Superintendent. Good morning, everybody. It looks like it's 9 o'clock, and we are ready to call our meeting to order. We are going to start off with Pledge of Allegiance, led by Member Corps, and that'll be followed by the National Anthem, sung by the Paradise Valley High School Elite Choir, which is accompanied by Ms. Tamara Duncan. And we'll start off with the pledge.
Please join me. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Thank you very much. Now we'll have our invocation by Reverend Rock Fremont from the Shepherd of the Hills United Church of Christ.
And we pray, God of all people, we give thanks for those engaged in the work of education. Grant our administrators the freshness of thought and clearness of vision to promote a standard of curriculum which honors our common life and protects our most vulnerable from the loss of opportunity. Enable our teachers to nurture the hearts and challenge the minds of their students, encouraging their eagerness to explore the world, searching mysteries, and taking the time to engage those who may be slow to learn. Give our students the strength to doubt with courage and the humility to learn from their mistakes and ours. May we all support this generation in the discovery of truth, that they may grow in grace and wisdom and be well prepared to face the challenges of life. We pray all this in the spirit of the one who unites us. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you very much. The national anthem was beautiful. Thank you. And thank you, Reverend. Mr. Wesley, would you take a roll call, please?
President Narducci.
Here.
Vice President Corr.
Here.
Superintendent Douglas.
Present.
Member Calvin Baker.
Present.
Member Broussard. Member Burton.
Here.
Member Chang. Member Kay.
Here.
Member Mack.
Here.
Member Taylor.
Here.
Member Wellborn.
Present.
You have a quorum.
Thank you very much. And I assume that, yes.
Here's Member Chang.
Hello, Member Chang.
Oh, she's here. Sorry, I missed the students.
Well, we missed you. Thanks for being here. We're going to move on with business reports. And first up, we have the President's report. And if Member Burton has anything she'd like to talk about, we'd appreciate that.
Okay. President Narducci, Superintendent Douglas, and Board, on March 5th and 6th, I attended the National Association of State Board of Education, or NASB, 2018 Legislative Conference in Washington, D.C., and the purpose is to sort of engage state board members in current federal legislative efforts that affect state boards. And it was interesting. I'm going to be very brief. What the sessions included: preparing today's students for tomorrow's jobs, principal leadership for early learning, diving deeper into teacher shortage data and implications for teacher prep programs, building state capacity for equity, and they talked in that session a lot about the challenges in just getting data to measure equity across states, and I think we're all familiar with that challenge. And then equitable school funding, and they also spent a lot of time talking about fiscal transparency and ESSA's requirement for school-level data. That I think is a lot of states are having challenges, again, getting school-level data to report and to meet the requirements of ESSA. On the second day of the conference, we heard from two members of Congress. Senator Isaacson of Georgia is a long-time senator, but was a former president of the Georgia State Board of Education, so he had an interesting perspective. And then Bobby Scott of Virginia. And they gave us an update. So this was the first week of March, an update on how they sort of anticipated the budget and reconciliation process to go. And as we know, on March 22nd, we have a budget for this fiscal year, and it was spot on as to how they said it would proceed from what was in the budget, what was probably going to go back in the budget. And so it was sort of enlightening for me. And then finally, we heard from U.S. Department of Education Deputy Assistant Secretary Jason Botel. And he took questions primarily from state board members about the frustration and challenges regarding the implementation of ESSA. On the one hand, they wanted to be flexible and innovative, but they felt very constrained by the laws of ESSA. So there was a lot of discussion about that. But I think his bottom line was that the state plans were an iterative changing document, and still was encouraging states to be innovative as they implemented the ESSA program. So overall, it was a great experience. I learned a lot, and that's my NASB brief.
Thank you very much. Very glad you got to go, and thank you for the report. Any members have any questions about it?
We'll see how that innovation with ESSA goes as Arizona works through the menu of assessments.
Well, we are certainly a trailblazer in that area, and it's known.
Yes. Interesting to see how they take it.
Thank you. There's nothing more at the President's report. We'll move on to the Superintendent's report.
Okay, thank you, Mr. President. One of the thing I want to share with the board today is some of the work that we've been doing in the department as far as the grants that go out to our school districts. In the past, first of all, we wanted to make it, since a great education for our students is my top priority, and fiscal accountability for the taxpayers and being good stewards of the taxpayers' money is my second priority. We've taken a look at how some of those things happen and basically put in some checks and balances to make sure that things are being checked in a way that's a little different than how some of my predecessors have set up those areas in the past. But the thing I'm really proud about is we've put a grants management process in place that now we were able to let schools know on March 1st what their allocation would be so that they can start preparing their grants and start preparing their budgets with a much more realistic understanding of where they should be. In the past, I think the grants have generally, they're told after the start of the school district or school calendar. And that, to me, is not a good place for our districts to be in. I've been on a school board. I know how challenging that is when they don't have the most accurate information that can possibly be. So I just wanted to let you know that we've made that change. It went very smoothly. We were able to get those grants out, not the grants themselves, but the let them know about what their appropriation would be. March 1st this year, and then a shout out because it was such a collaborative effort within the department. The financial people now take care of finances and make sure that all of that is accounted for appropriately, but their piece did not come alone. It came with a huge effort on the part of all our program areas that to make sure that our schools are in the best place they can possibly be. So thanks to everyone who worked on that project.
Thank you, Superintendent. Anything else?
For right now, I think that was enough. We'll be talking a lot about standards in a little bit, so I'll save comments on that for later.
Appreciate that. Members, any questions for the superintendent? Thank you. We'll move on to the executive director's report if he has something to report.
President Arducci, Superintendent Douglas, members of the board. A member requested that I provide an update on the menu of assessments. Since the last State Board of Education meeting in February, the State Board staff, as well as the department staff, have continued to meet in regard to the implementation of the menu of assessments. Both parties are aware that there are questions that remain from the field regarding the implementation of the policy. Both of the staffs are working collaboratively to ensure those questions are answered in an effective manner and plan on working with the field to find the best solutions. Throughout the month of April, staff members plan to finalize information, provide it to the board, the field, and educational stakeholders to ensure alignment to the menu timeline presented at the February State Board meeting.
Thank you, Director Williams. Do we have any questions for Director Williams? No? Thank you very much. Anything else from you? Appreciate that. Move on to call to the public. And as a reminder, and I'll read this just so that we stay consistent, this is the time for the public to comment on non-agendized and consent agenda items. Members of the board may not discuss items that are not specifically identified on the agenda. Therefore, pursuant to law, action taken as a result of public comment will be limited to directing staff to study the matter, responding to any criticism, or scheduling the matter for further consideration and decision at a later date. So with that, we'll move on to call to the public.
President Arducci, members of the board, requests to speak for item 2 in regard to any non-agendized and consent. There were none submitted.
Thank you. I'm glad I reminded everybody that we didn't have to do anything this time. We'll move on to the consent agenda. All items on the consent agenda will be considered together unless anyone wants to have any of the items removed. Do any of the items on the consent agenda need to be removed?
I'd just like to pull item F, like Frank, for a question or two.
So item F, which is approval of Teachers of Tomorrow as an alternative educator preparation program provider for secondary education, will be removed from the consent agenda. Anything else from any other members? Seeing none, can I have a motion to approve the consent agenda items A through, what was it? A1 through 12, B, C, D, E in total.
So move.
Second.
Okay. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. Now we'll move to item F, which was removed from the consent agenda. Superintendent Douglas.
Yeah, I guess just a couple of questions for Executive Director Williams. This came before the board before, and it was sent back. Can you give us a little bit of oversight of some of the changes that were made? And I really have a lot of questions maybe not for now, maybe offline, about how these alternative educator prep programs differ from what we would expect to see from our universities. Are they much shorter programs, more, I'll use the term more concise, whatever? Can we get just a little bit, or Mr. Baden?
President Narducci, Superintendent Douglas, the applicant Teachers of Tomorrow submitted 2 applications to the board for an elementary alternative preparation program and a secondary preparation program. The alternative ed prep application review committee recommended the board, and the board ultimately approved the elementary application. The review committee recommended that the board, and the board ultimately did, deny the secondary application. The reason that the review committee recommended denial of the secondary application is that the applicant inadvertently transposed several answers and descriptions in their secondary application from the elementary application. And although the applicant did provide it the day of the review committee's meeting, after they had realized their mistake because some review committee members raised concerns because they caught that, the review committee felt that they didn't have adequate time to review all of that information, and based on the timelines that are outlined in board rule, recommended denial. The applicant, by board rule, had 60 days to resubmit, in this case, they did resubmit. The review committee then reviewed that resubmitted application that had the correct information in there, and based on that application, recommended approval. And they received a score that was almost identical to their elementary application as well. As to your second question on how these programs differ from the traditional prep programs that are usually at universities, we can look in and maybe get a little more specifics. The rules for the alt prep programs are substantially different than the rules for the traditional prep programs, and that is because by statute they're required to be different. But we can work with department staff to give a little more specifics on how they differ. Very generally speaking, the alt prep programs are those programs that award or issue intern certificates for those individuals to complete the prep programs while they're in the classroom, as opposed to and usually those are for career switchers is usually how we think about it. And the traditional prep programs is usually how we think of a student going through the 4-year track after high school at the university, doing their student teaching, and then getting a standard certificate. But I think maybe your question was for more specific, Superintendent Douglas, and we'd be happy to get back to you with those.
One of the reasons I bring it up is because I'm concerned about what I see, the direction we seem to be taking, not only the board-wise, but legislatively. To me, it seems like almost a lowering of standards and of how we train our teachers, and I'm very concerned about that, to make sure we get the best people in the classroom, the most well-trained people in the classroom. And it's not only content and professional standards, but even what I see reflected in our disciplinary actions that come before us. I sometimes wonder if we're holding the standards high enough in these programs. So I appreciate that, and maybe I can get with you and with more specific questions that, at least for me, whether the rest of the board would be interested or not. But thank you for that update on it.
Thank you, Deputy Director Baden, as well as Superintendent Douglas. Is there any discussion that we need to have regarding F beyond that? And I appreciate your comments, Superintendent Douglas. Can I get a motion to approve consent agenda item 3F?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
May I explain my vote?
Yes.
I'm going to vote aye because I realize they have fulfilled the requirements in the law. But again, as I raised, I have concerns about not just this program, but some of the others. But so far, they've complied.
Thank you. We're going to move on to agenda item number 4, which is call to the public under the general session. Before I read, do we have? We do. Okay, thank you. And do we have a number of them, as far as we know? Okay. I'll just read this for reference, and this is with respect to the time for the public to comment on general session and certification enforcement action items. Members of the board may not discuss items that are not specifically identified on the agenda. Therefore, pursuant to law, action taken as a result of public comment will be limited to directing staff to study the matter, responding to any criticism, or scheduling the matter for further consideration and decision at a later date. With that, we'll turn it over to call of the public.
President Arducci, members of the board, prior to me calling up the individuals who have submitted a request to speak form, I do want to inform for the record that the letter from Excel and Ed, the letter from Arizona Science Teachers Association, the letter from Arizona Science Education Leadership Association, and the letter from Lacey Weiser were provided to the board members last week, and each board member has a copy of those public comments. First up, we will have Bruce Jones, followed by Sarah Torres.
Good morning, President Arducci, members of the board. I'm here representing the Arizona Science Education Leadership Association. We're a group of 300 educators, leaders in universities and school districts and in classrooms. And upon receiving the agenda items last week and taking a look at the draft agenda, we were very excited about some of the things that we saw in there. We've been working as a group over the last 6 years, since about 2011, on looking at what the standards how they might change in science. There was a national movement in 2011, which resulted in the publication of a document called the from the National Research Council called the the Framework for K-12 Science Education. And based on that document, nationally, some new standards were produced. Arizona was one of the lead states in helping look at what the next generation science standards might look like. So we have a lot of expertise in this state. And as we looked at the introduction to the draft standards, we were excited to see that a lot of those recommendations from the National Research Council were in there. An emphasis on three-dimensional instruction, emphasizing not only the core content, but also science and engineering practices and cross-cutting concepts that tie the multiple disciplines together. But as we started to dig into the standards, we started to see some things that bothered us. Since a number of our members worked on the working groups and committee to write the standards, we noticed the inclusion of a list of key concepts that essentially moved things backwards. We were looking, the instructions to the writing committee were that we were to write standards, not performance objectives. Performance objectives being much more delineated in the exact things that were supposed to be taught. And the inclusion of these key concepts and these connections to other content area standards, it says, are included to assist teachers when implementing the science standard and are not intended to be a minimum or maximum content limit. But in effect, teachers will gravitate immediately to that list of things. And they'll say, oh, these are the 5 items that I have to work with. In fact, in one of the documents that was based on the framework that was used in the development of these standards, Working with Big Ideas in Science Education, it says on page 46, a detailed curriculum document turns science activities into a routine aimed at getting through the syllabus to meet requirements rather than spending time to ensure deep understanding. Too much detail limits the potential for teachers to take account of students' interests. Moreover, the more detailed the specification, the more problematic the decisions about the exact sequence, and the greater the risk of the detail obscuring sight of the overall aims, the development of big ideas and science inquiry capabilities. So based on that, we would ask that those key concepts be removed from the standard for the public review, and that any future drafts would not have such delineated items. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Sarah Torres, followed by Lisa Fink.
Good morning. I am Sarah Torres, the Executive Director of Arizona Science Teachers Association, also known as Asta. And on behalf of the 1,000 members of our organization, I'm here to share our position on the draft document of the Arizona Science Standards. Throughout the standards development process, many ASTA members have been involved as working group members. After reviewing the presentation that ADE is sharing with you today, ASTA members became concerned about the process outlined on slide 4. ADE has had an internal review of the document prior to public comment, which has caused concern about the lack of transparency. We are alarmed that a similar lack of transparency will occur with the internal review that is scheduled after the working groups have addressed the public comments. If the last internal review serves only to address grammatical edits that do not change the language of the intent of the document, then ASTA's concern for the internal review is without issue. However, if the internal review results in changing the content of the document, then the working groups need to reconvene and ratify the document prior to be submitted to you. As noted in the directive given by ADE to the development of the science standards, the Arizona standards will be written for Arizona teachers and students by Arizona educators and content experts, and that grade level standards, not performance objectives, should be written. If any content is changed during the internal review, then the directive is no longer valid and the transparency of the process and the product are negated. All public feedback should be shared, and any changes by the working groups should be supported by justification and evidence. If an internal review is required, then ASTA suggests that ADE present to the board the 4 following drafts of the standard as they have been developed, indicating the evolutionary changes and which group revised the document. This includes the November 2017 draft that former ADE Science and STEM Director Lacey Weezer submitted to Superintendent Douglas. Today's draft, the future draft of the working group following the public feedback, and the standards that will be submitted for adoption following the final internal review. Transparency of the process, illustrating how the document has changed over time and by whom, is required. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you.
Lisa Fink, followed by Alexandre Dominguez.
President Arducci and members of the board, thank you for your time. My name is Lisa Fink, and I am here representing the group called the Mommy Lobby. And I am going to speak solely to the history standards. And my concerns will be brought forth in regards to the National Council for History Education and their report that they had issued on how to improve education in the social studies. First of all, it said K-12 should be history-based. At all levels, K-12, the social studies curriculum should be history-centered with geography, economics, and civics incorporating a historical context. In the proposed standards, this is missing. At K-12 curricula will be unified with genuine historical themes. This is also missing in the current standards, proposed standards. At K-3, great stories of history be emphasized and names and places made familiar. That is missing, in particular for K-2. It has gone back to the old social studies standards of trying to teach children how to be good citizens and what's around them, instead of teaching good historical stories and geographical facts. And also, according to the child's brain development, these grades are the perfect type to memorize basic historical facts, geographical and civic facts. Instead, the standards at these grade levels concentrate on comparing and explaining without the background knowledge to do so. And this is, unfortunately, a complete waste of time and misses the perfect opportunity to lay a foundation of historical and geographical background knowledge to build upon in future grade levels. In regards to geography, key concepts of geography such as location, place, and region are tied in separately to major ideas of history such as time, period, and events. Geography and history in tandem enable learners to understand how events and places have affected each other across time, and that is recommendations from the Department of Education. Unfortunately, this correlation is non-existent. Economics, there is much better in regards to financial literacy. However, there's a dearth of standards and also concepts in regards to free market and capitalism and the great thinkers such as Adam Smith and others in that era. Also, there's no studying of the great figures of history, and that is totally absent. And again, I encourage that the State Board look at going back to more of a history-based curricula, and this is outlined in the Educated Child, and this will achieve much of the desires that has been articulated in this proposed standards. First of all, the intellectual function of history. By studying history, we can take the rich accumulation of experience and make it part of our own wisdom. The civic function of history, basically for individuals to make intelligent decisions. Good decisions often require historical intelligence. And the moral function of history. The study of the past has long served the function of teaching about right and wrong. Now, also, I am with a charter organization, and according to our mission and philosophy, we utilize a teacher-led approach to education. Much of what I see is mainly inquiry-based, and unfortunately, we do provide for that in our education, but again, it misses the boat in regards to our mission and philosophy, and we would have to change that. Thank you.
Thank you.
The last request to speak is Alexandre Dominguez.
Thank you. Good morning, President Narducci, Superintendent Douglas, members of the board. My name is Alexandre Dominguez, here representing ExcellaNet in Action. I'm here today to speak to the decision before you to establish a set of criteria for valid alternative assessments to be used as one of the good cause exemptions under MOER. As you know, the law allows students who fail to meet the MOER cut score on the reading portion of the third grade statewide ELA exam to demonstrate sufficient reading skills through one of these alternative assessments, which we wholly support. Our organization has championed and provided implementation support to all states with MOER-like laws on the books. And in our experience, the issue of alternative assessments and cut scores for those assessments has proven to be the biggest implementation challenge. Deciding whether to promote or retain a student, as you know, is a hugely important decision. Alternative assessments used to make those decisions should therefore have the highest degree of reliability and validity. To this end, we believe that the criteria being proposed in Agenda Item 4E could be further strengthened just a bit, specifically as it relates to Criteria 1 and 6. Currently, Criterion 1 relies on validity and reliability information available on a publisher's website and/or technical reports. We would urge the board to use a specified, proven standard rather than relying on publishers' information to deem an exam technically adequate. We have some more detailed recommendations for how we can improve that language that we did include in the letter that we provided the board previously. Additionally, we'd like to highlight the importance of setting cut scores for promotion for each approved alternative assessment, which should be aligned to the cut score for promotion that the board will be setting soon on the statewide assessment. This ensures that there is equity and that all students are being held to the same standard, which is our priority. To make it clearer, therefore, we would recommend adding to Criterion 6, which references scoring procedures by testing vendors, that cut scores for promotion will be set by the board for these assessments. Nationally, Arizona currently ranks lowest on the standard for promotion when compared to 9 other states that have a MOER-like law on the books. We recognize that the state board is in the preliminary stages of establishing a cut score for promotion on the statewide assessment, and we do strongly support and applaud the board's intent to set a higher standard for that. We do want to make sure, however, that we honor that this important work that you'll be doing with quality alternative assessments, as well as equally rigorous cut scores for those assessments. Overall, we all know how critical the window between kindergarten and third grade is, and our overall priority is to ensure that no Arizona student falls through the cracks. Therefore, we're more than happy to continue working with the board and serve as a resource as needed in order to achieve this. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we have any others?
President Arducci, members of the board, we do not.
Thank you, everybody. We'll move on with the agenda item. 4A.
President Arducci, members of the board, item 4A1 is an update on the ADE Connect portal for the 2016-2017 A through F accountability system. Dr. Fletcher from the department is here to provide that update.
Good morning, President Narducci, Superintendent Douglas, members of the board. For the record, Dr. Jennifer Fletcher, Chief Accountability Officer for the Department of Education. I stood before you a month ago saying we were working on code changes and updating the ADE Connect portal so that we could get A through F FY17 letter grade data to the schools. I am hopeful that we can have it done by this Friday. However, I would like to be honest, we are doing extensive validation checks, particularly for all schools that may have changed models compared to prelim data. When that happens, it doesn't mean we can just rerun, right, one little section. We have to rerun everything and continue to validate. So while I'm hopeful we can meet Friday's deadline, again, there may be a few days into next week that we push because I would like to ensure that we have accurate data as opposed to rushed work that leads us to more issues down the road. Okay, so again, hopeful for this Friday. Keep your fingers crossed. We are working diligently, again, as fast as we can, but with accuracy. If not, maybe a few days into next week, just for full transparency purposes. But we really want to make sure that, especially, like I said, for those schools that changed model types, that everything is accurate and calculated the way that it was intended with the last board approval.
Thank you. Do we have any questions in that regard? Member Walborn.
Just a quick question. Does this, I appreciate the extra work you're putting together to ensure that we're accurate on this. Do you see that as impacting our overall timeline in terms of getting the data necessary for setting scores next month?
No, like I said, I'm expecting if we need it, just a few extra days, but cut scores, everything would still be ready for the April board meeting.
Thank you.
Good question. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Anything else?
That's good.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Move on to the next item.
President Arducci, members of the board, item 4A2 is an update on the progress of 2017-2018 A through F accountability system. So as Dr. Fletcher has been talking about ADE Connect portal, I do want to make the board informed that the process between the board team and the board staff and the department is very collaborative. So we do talk on a weekly basis. I had an opportunity to speak with the board team last evening and last week in regard to the items that were brought forth to the board at the February state board meeting. There are 3 items which needs to be changed for the 17-18 letter grades due to federal ESSA state plan in which the board team has begun work on that. From there, we're going to try to hit the easiest things to change within the code, and then we'll start tackling those 6 items that were on 4B2 from last board meeting. And that includes the end count, the growth and proficiency weighting, both within the indicator and within the system as a whole. We do plan on bringing some evidence of that code change and modeling to the board at the April board meeting.
Thank you. Any questions from my right side? Left side? Thank you very much. And no action needed there, so we'll move on to B.
President Narducci, Superintendent Douglas, members, the legislative update, we are about 3/4 of the way through the legislative session, so it is entirely possible that the legislature will adjourn before we meet next, but usually late April, early May, the past few years is when they've been adjourning, so we'll be real close there at the end. I do want to, before getting into some of the other legislative updates, I do want to mention that Member Burton and Member Broussard, since we last met, were confirmed by the Senate, and I would say that they received some glowing comments and recommendations at Senate Education, so that's always nice to have. As I'm sure everybody is probably aware by now, Prop 301 was extended last week. There had been talk of that moving, and it started moving very quickly. So although that doesn't directly affect the board, that is something that's good information for us to have. That 0.6 cent sales tax was extended 20 years. Currently it's going to expire in 2021, so that's going to go to 2041. And the only change that the legislature made was to take out the roughly $64 million a year, which goes towards some of the bonding that had been established when Prop 301 was first enacted, and that $64 million is now going to the Classroom Site Fund, which most of that goes to teacher salaries in one way or another. So again, that doesn't affect the board, but something that is a pretty significant development for K-12 and something good for us to know. And if any members have questions, I'm sure that some of your own organizations provide you with a lot more detailed information on Prop 301 distributions and the Classroom Site Fund distributions, but those are things that I'd be happy to provide as well. A couple other things that are going on at the legislature. School safety, again, this is something that members have probably also heard about, and I know we've talked to some members about this as well. There's some talk of some school safety measures moving. Specifically for the board, what that would mean for us is potentially more resources for school resource officers. There has not been a specific proposal on a dollar amount announced yet, but that's something that may end up coming before this board, as we are the ultimate approving body. But again, we'd be working in hand with the department as they, if there are more resources for that, how they would allocate that. But that's something we'll keep the board apprised of. As to the specifics of some of what's going on at the legislature outside of those items, last week was the last week to hear bills in the regular standing committees. So from here on out, it's probably only going to be the appropriations committees with budget bills. There may be some other special meetings, though. School safety is a good example. There may be some special meetings of standing committees to hear that legislation if that's introduced late. But usually what that signals is now we start transitioning to budget talks. And so hopefully, I think right now they're having small group meetings within the legislature about the budget, and hopefully that means that things can start moving, and maybe we will adjourn by the time we meet next. Some of the specific legislation I did just want to go through briefly with you. You have the legislative update that Alicia, our Executive Director Williams, included on the update on Friday. The first is Senate Bill 1411, which is Senator Allen's, what we're calling the dashboard bill. This is the bill that requires a letter grade for each indicator of the A to F system. We are still talking with the sponsor on that and working with the department. There's still some outstanding questions, not necessarily about how the letter grade for each indicator will work, but there are some smaller changes in there that may look small but would have significant impacts for the work of the board and also the department. So we're still working through some of those. That specifically has to do with some of the data appeals, but also with just appeals in general. So that's things that we're still working through. There's also a few bills in here related to seals, diploma seals, and also a pilot program. So there's a personal finance seal, there's a civics seal, and there's a civics pilot program. The board in all three of those cases generally is going to be charged with developing the minimum requirements to issuing the seals and also for participation in the pilot program. The seals, if you'll remember, are based off of what was passed, I believe it was last year, which is the seal of biliteracy. It's the same sort of idea. If a student demonstrates those competencies, which would be set by the board, a seal would be affixed to their diploma. So it's the same concept with that civic seal and the personal finance seal. For the pilot program, that bill has been moving, but there's money attached to it, so it'll end up going into the budget discussions. But that's that civics pilot program where certain schools would be able to participate and administer a selected assessment that would be selected through an RFP in lieu of that naturalization exam, which is required for graduation right now. So we're working with the sponsor on that to make sure that our duties are clear and that expectations are set on what's expected of the board. A couple other items. One is statewide assessment and menu of assessments. Senate Bill 1449 was recently amended to require the board to direct the department, but essentially it would be the department would be issuing an RFP for the statewide assessment, a new statewide assessment, and also for the menu of assessments. That latter piece is important in that that's the ultimate goal of menu of assessments, is to use statewide dollars to pay for those assessments to ensure equity. And so that's an important development that the members of the legislature feel that they want enshrined in statute or in session law somewhere so that we can signal to the field that there is a plan in place. We have been working with the department on what that RFP would look like. There is a statutory deadline for September 1, I believe. However, we would probably engage in that work sooner rather than later because of some of the time crunches. Lastly, there is a little issue in that we are hoping to get addressed and did get added to House Bill 2534, which regards teacher certification. There was, if you recall, last year, the board asked Representative Boyer, who was good enough to sponsor a bill, for the board to allow for reciprocal discipline, which allows us to expedite some of the disciplinary process while still allowing for due process. There was a cross-reference issue that was very small but was still important enough that we needed to get addressed. So Representative Carter was good enough to put that fix for us onto her bill. It's just a cleanup, and it's a small change, but it's something important for us. And then finally, as we start winding down closer to session and we look at all these bills and what the board's going to be charged with, board staff is going to come up with a chart so that we can have sort of a one-pager look at what's expected of the board coming out of session of all these legislative requirements. We have an existing chart of the board's powers and duties and what we're required to do, so we will provide both of those so that all the board members are aware of what's expected of us of all these legislation that may end up getting passed. And we can provide that at the conclusion of legislative session and as bills start to get signed. And so with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Deputy Director Abaden. Do we have any questions from any of the members? Seeing none, thank you very much. We'll move on to the next agenda item, 4C.
President Narducci, members of the board, 4C is a presentation on the draft Arizona Science and Arizona History and Social Science standards for public consideration and input. Associate Superintendent Carol Lippert is presenting. I was making sure I got your title right.
You did great. Okay. You did great. Let me just pull it up real quick, and then actually Superintendent Douglas is going to begin.
Yes. I'm going to kick this off, President Narducci, if you don't mind, members of the board. We're bringing some information to you about the Arizona Science and the Arizona History and Social Science draft standards. Please note, and this is much further down the road when we get to the point where the board considers these for approval, but one of the things is the Arizona History and Social Science as opposed to the term social studies. So I just wanted to share some information with you today. We're just going to give you a very broad overview. You've been given copies of the draft standards themselves. and we also will have a PowerPoint for you. I want to first, before we start out, is thank our Arizona educators for the work that they've put into this. And we did have some community working groups also that gave us some feedback and were involved in the process. And this is something that's very, very important to me. I'll say my philosophy of education is it's to not solely to educate our children to make them worker bees or college applicants, but it's about making them great citizens. And my personal belief is our education system actually belongs to the citizens of Arizona. So for them not to be involved in the process in any way, shape, or form is unacceptable to me. So we've, as you've already heard, we've changed the process a little bit. This is the first time since I've been superintendent that I've actually been able to really, I'll use the term oversee a process for lack of a better term, or put some thought and changes into it. When I was first elected, we had a process that was just in place by a former superintendent, and then when we did the reevaluation of Arizona College and Career Ready Math and English Language standards, AKA Common Core, that was directed where we started, was directed by the governor, came to the state board and said we'd start with those standards, and then a process was created. It's in conjunction with his staff and the state board staff. So this is the first time that this is not a very much changed, but a slight tweaks, because I will not bring to this board anything that I don't think is appropriate, and there has been quite some discussion over standards over the course before I took office and during the course of my being in office. So the last science and then social studies standards, still social studies standards, were from 2004 and 2005. I don't remember which one was which. But it pretty much we had to start from scratch. So it began with public input, public comment, and then it went to teacher working groups and teams to work out some of the problems and issues. What will go from here, and you can kind of follow this slide along, we'll open them for 60 days for public comment. We'll have technical reviewers in it. Once again, I want to see our community groups, our citizens, our parents involved to give input and be part of the process, because after all, it's their children that we're educating. So before I hand this over to Carol, I'd like to make a few comments on some things that I heard in Call to the Public, which I think what I heard presents an interesting conundrum. We hear on one side, and I say everything I say with all due respect to our teachers, to our parents, to our citizens, to our board members, absolutely everybody involved. But on one hand, if we take a look at the comment or think about the comments that were made from science, it was about this is a teacher profession process, that those are the people who should be involved. And the one comment that and I think I have it, the framework for K-12 science education and the work that's been done with that, the comment was that that was based on Next Generation, which was Next Generation Common Core science standards, which this board rejected and chose never to adopt back in the original discussion of all those things. But it's supposed to be a framework that, for lack of a better word, is created and controlled by the teachers. Then we hear from Ms. Fink from the social studies history side of this that that's not a process that it seems was really deemed appropriate, that it should be more community-led and it shouldn't be just take the word of whatever groups, whatever people, whoever are all involved in the working groups. I believe we have to get to a point of where it becomes more of a collaborative process, and I think that does take work, because I said it before and I'll say it again. It's the children that we're educating, and in my opinion, it's the expectation that those parents have for the education their children will have. That's who we serve. We're not here to make merely worker bees or college applicants to make some special interest groups happy. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about why did the standards come before the board or not come before the board in December. Quite frankly, I wouldn't have brought those standards as they were exactly before this board in December. And it's exactly because of some of the things that Mrs. Fink pointed out to this board that, and I'm sure from her comments today, I don't know if she's still back there or not. I can't tell, Mrs. Fink. The very comments that she made were the very things I was concerned about. We had science standards, just one thing off the top of my head, that really had no mention of the scientific method or teaching the scientific method to students within them. In history and economics, there weren't the things that I'm hearing from parents that they want their children to understand. Exactly like the history of this nation, our founding documents, all the things that will make great citizens of our students and help them understand exactly where we've come from as a nation. And that's the historical part. Founding Fathers documents are just one piece of it. Do I think we're exactly where we need to be? Not, in my opinion, not yet, but I think that's what the public process is for, is to open it up and get the feedback from organizations and help bring this all into place. So with that, I think that's enough. I think I'll call Associate Superintendent Lippert forward to share the rest.
Thank you. President Narducci, members of the board, I am going to present to you today about the science portion of the drafts that you've been presented with, and then Tammy Waller will be coming up after I complete on the science portion to talk you through the history and social science standards. So first off, just so you are aware, yes, we did have working groups. In those working groups, we had right around 110 educators representing districts, charters, institutes of higher ed, and 13 of our 15 counties. We do have, if you're interested, you have a little free time and you want to just peruse it, we do have all of their agendas and the things that they were working on in those working group meetings posted on the K-12 site. The link is there for you if you would like to do that. Also, just so you are aware, on the K-12 site, the public comment, if you remember originally before we opened both sets of those standards, we did go through a round of public comment. Every bit of that public comment is available on that website and has been since the very beginning. It's a system that does update live as people are putting in public comments. So if you wanted to go back and see what the original public comment was about the original science and social studies standards, you're welcome to go through that. It's, I think, pretty easy to navigate and see through, but you can see not only there's graphs there, but also the actual narrative comment that people put in originally. So if you do want to go back in time and take a look at that, you are welcome to do so. If you can move to the next slide. So, as was brought up in public comment, yes, we do, whoops. Got a little excited there. We do always look towards the research base when we are working on our standards. And so you can see through time that research base has changed, just like with anything that we do. We learn more and we get better at it, and we understand better what we need to be doing throughout time. So the two major documents that were used as a foundation as the working groups were working on our current science standards that you have in front of you are listed there, the framework and the big ideas. So in the big ideas, and somebody did mention in public comment that's sort of this three-dimensional approach. So I'm going to take you through just briefly today when we say a three-dimensional approach, what the heck that means, because it is probably something that you maybe haven't heard talked about quite a bit. So in the big ideas, they ask that students both be able to use science and be able to understand science. So using science is about the process of scientific activity. So it's finding causes for phenomenon, developing explanations using available evidence, using knowledge to create, and understanding how, and helping them to understand how science impacts the world around us. Thus, each of the standards in the draft standards that you will see will ask students to use science in some way. The other portion of that, though, is, of course, knowing science. You can't use science if you don't know science. So a portion of it is dedicated to knowing science. Or, excuse me, I apologize. If you look, we kind of went through and color-coded just to sort of help people to recognize when the different types of knowing science are coming in. So the orangey color is physical science, the blue is earth and space, and the green would reference life science. And so I'll give you an example. In one standard in the second grade, students are asked to observe, describe, and predict how wind and water change the shape of the land, resulting in a variety of landforms. So this standard is then coded as E1, U1. So E1 would be the earth and space science, the first one, so composition of the earth and its atmosphere and the natural and human processes, you can see it up there. And then U1 would be using science expectation that states science's purpose is to find cause or causes of phenomena in the natural world. So in this standard, they use their knowledge to find the cause to the changes in the land. So using and knowing, they go hand in hand. So each of the standards is coded to reference where we're at in the using science and where we're at in knowing science. Thank you. Also, one of the things that is prevalent in cross-cutting, in the research base with the framework, are the cross-cutting concepts. So you can see we've got patterns, cause and effect, scale, portion, and quantity, systems and system models, energy and matter, structure and function, stability and change. Cross-cutting concepts are those that bridge disciplinary boundaries and are applicable to science and engineering. Though these concepts are essential to a complete understanding of science and engineering, students have often been expected to understand them without any concrete instruction or explicit support. Like all areas of instruction, there are age-appropriate expectations for these concepts. These expectations are explained more fully in the draft standards on page 3 of the draft standards and within Appendix 1. And also, you're welcome to get the book, and they're really explained in detail within the book. So an example for the cross-cutting concepts, just to kind of put it in perspective for you, if you take a moment to think about plants in terms of patterns, what comes to mind when you think about plants in terms of patterns? How might thinking about plants in terms of patterns help students to better understand and investigate the phenomenon? So that's what we're asking if we're thinking about patterns in plants, right? Another example from an engineering perspective might be thinking about a screwdriver in terms of structure and function. What comes into mind, right? You have short screwdrivers for certain functions. You have longer screwdrivers for different functions. You have different tips, those kinds of things. So that's an engineering perspective that helps them then to begin to extrapolate that to other kinds of tools and thinking about how they can make better tools or better use of the tools that they have. Science and engineering practices, there's been some questions about this. We used to call it the scientific method, as the superintendent alluded to. And, you know, for decades, that's what we've called it, right? But what we're asking now is to think about science and engineering practices in terms of all of the different things that students need to be able to do to truly research and investigate something, anything. And to understand that it may not just be a linear process. You know, if you think about the scientific method, we told them you start with the hypothesis and then you gather your data, and, you know, it goes through this sort of linear process all the way through to where you're developing your conclusions. And what we know about life is sometimes it works that way, and when it does, that's really awesome. But often what we find as we begin to collect data, we find maybe our question was a little off and we need to go back and we need to gather more background information and better define the problem that we're working on and then go back through the process again. So what we're trying to teach students through this is, one, the real process of science and engineering, that it's not always linear, that we do have to be resilient and we do have to understand that sometimes things aren't going to go the way we want them to go. And so we need to go back in time, reassess, reevaluate, and really investigate the problem that's at hand. So science and engineering practices, when done well, are going to ask us to do that. So you will see the science and engineering practices within the standards, and I'll take you also through an example. So when layered together, the three dimensions provide a solid knowledge foundation for students while also building essential skills in investigation, review of evidence, and design of solutions. So we pulled out one example of how it might work. Now, remember, there's myriad ways that teachers could choose to teach different standards. They also will have students sitting in front of them, so they will know what background knowledge their students already have and what needs to be filled in. So we just pulled out one example from 6th grade. And it is a life science, and it says for each area there's sort of an overarching descriptive of what's happening at that grade level. So for 6th grade it says that students develop an understanding of purposes of internal cell structures and their roles in life processes. And then if you look down below, and I apologize, that is rather small, I should have blown it up. When I printed it out, it's nice and big. Thank you. Oh, look at you. Thank you. It says develop and use a model to explain the organizational levels of structures in multicellular organisms consisting of organ systems, organs, tissues, and cells. So I'm sure you've all learned about that at some point in your science career, correct? We did put some key concepts over on the other side that might help to guide a teacher as they're thinking about this standard. And we would also ask them to look to the statement above where it kind of gives the general expectation overarching for life sciences for 6th grade. So if you'd scroll to the next one. What you will see in this particular example is students are asked to know and use science. So that's sort of our center of the circle there, core ideas in knowing and using science. So knowing science is L1. It's coded as an L1, where organisms are organized on a cellular basis and have a finite lifespan. And it is coded for using science as a U1. Science's purpose is to find the cause or causes of phenomenon in the natural world. The science and engineering practice in here is actually to develop and use a model. So developing and using a model developing a model may consist of something like a diagram, a drawing, a physical replica, a mathematical representation, analogy, computer simulation. The list goes on. There's lots of opportunities and lots of different things that students can be asked to do that involve developing a model. They're also asked to use that model. So an example of using the model is where we may ask the students after they've developed their model, they then use their model to talk about whatever it is that they're supposed to know and understand. So you may ask them questions about their model. Which part is hydrophobic? Which part is hydrophilic? You might ask them to identify key functions. You might ask them to explain it. What kinds of molecules could pass through there very easily? What might we have to add energy to make it go through? It's all that idea of how the cell membrane functions for within the cell processes. So if you scroll through. And then the cross-cutting concept that they're asked to do here is structure and function. So again, the student would use their model that they have developed to talk about structure and function. So in this example, maybe they might compare the cell membrane to the walls of a castle, right? The walls of the castle have guards. They let some things in, they keep some things out. The guards communicate with what's happening inside of the cell so that they know what to let in and what to let out, different things like that. So very simplistic example, quick example, but I did want to give you just a basic understanding of how we take that standard and then teachers really can delve into that standard and begin to ask students to truly not just know the content, because it is definitely important and they have to know the content, but then also do things with that content to deepen their understanding and to expand even to other phenomena that they are seeing in the world around them. So I see I jump ahead. So basically it's putting it all together, 3 dimensions, knowing and using science, then of course starting with the standard itself, and then using core ideas, science and engineering practices, and cross-cutting concepts. So in general, the changes are we shifted from performance objectives to broader standards to allow for greater depth and more connections. The 2004 science standard was written with 6 strands, multiple concepts per strand, and multiple performance objectives per concept. If you do go back and look at the public comment from that standard, you will see that people who commented really felt like our current performance objectives were overly prescriptive, very small, disjointed. They did not flow from grade to grade. And so that is some of what the working groups tried to fix. And in fact, you will find that these standards are organized around big ideas in science. To develop a progression and build coherence. So part of what you'll see, there's a grid at the end of each grade band, and in that grid from the grade band, you will see how the standards are addressed in each grade level. And I hope you notice that very purposefully, the content comes back in older grade levels. And the purpose for that is, one, we know that students need to see and work with content more than once to truly internalize it and understand it, but also because we're going to build on depth and complexity as students get older and as their brains grow and develop. So I hope that you notice that as you're looking at the grade band standards, and you can see that there's a grid at the end of each grade band. They're also connected with content. And at high school level, you will notice that there are now essential versus plus standards for high school. So the recommendation is for the essential standards that these would be the standards that are learned by all students across 3 credits of high school standard science. And as you recall, you just approved the updated graduation requirements. You're well aware that there are 3 credits of science that are required. So these 3 credits would include all 14 big ideas of science to prepare students for adult science literacy wherever they may end up, whether it be college, trade school, in the world of work. And when we're thinking about the state assessment, which I will talk about on my next slide, those essential standards would be the things that we would expect all students to know and understand. So those would be the standards that would be assessed on any state assessment that may happen at high school. Then the plus standards are designed to extend the learning of the essential standards. Apologize, I made a typo there. They are specific to physics, chemistry, earth and space, and biology courses, and truly are designed to prepare students for college-level courses. So these would be the kinds of expanded learning that students, if they are interested in being pre-med, then they would want to take that 4th credit of science specific to maybe the life sciences or maybe even chemistry, physics, depending upon the direction that they would like to go in their future career. However, if those are assessed, they would be assessed by the district, not by the state level, because again, those need to be developed with the student in mind so that the students are taking that course that they need to take so that they can be ready for whatever they plan to do after K-12. So the science assessment is something that has been coming up quite a bit, a lot of questions about it. So I put together, and I apologize, I know this chart's a little bit much, and I tried it like 4 different ways, and that was the best I could come up with. So I'll walk you through it a little bit. Just wanted to give you a general idea of where we were at with the old AIMS science assessment and where we would be with the new assessment. You can see school year 17-18 is the one we're currently in. 18-19 then would be next year, 19-20, and so on and so forth. The intent would be that the new science assessment would be available in 2021. And the new assessment would cover the grade bands as they are set up in these standards. So the assessment is now currently given in the 4th grade. It would move to the 5th grade. And the 5th grade assessment would cover concepts from grades 3 through 5. The old assessment, AIM Science, is currently given in the 8th grade, and that the new one would remain at the 8th grade, and that would cover concepts from 6th through 8th grade. And the AIMS Science Assessment currently is given in the 10th grade and would then be intended to move to the 11th grade, covering concepts from 9th through 11th grade. Now, keep in mind, there's a couple of things going on. One, we are well aware that there's some legislation that's coming forward that may change this whole picture. And if it does, then of course we will readjust and reassess where we're at. This is our current reality. It's kind of where we're at right now with the best that we know. The other piece is that we do intend for school year 1920, we do intend to ask the Federal Department of Education if we can get a waiver for the purposes of science testing for 1920. Now, can I guarantee we will be awarded that waiver? No, I cannot. However, what we would like is to not have to give the AIMS science assessment in 1920, since we will be doing that transition to new standards, and it's always really confusing when we're testing on an old set of standards and now we're changing to new standards. So the idea would be in 1920, rather than having the AIMS science assessment, would be to use that as an opportunity to test items, new content items, to see, to allow the assessment group to get information back about those content items, to see which ones are effective and which ones need to be changed, addressed, and the assessment group would go through that process that they always go through to, bring in working groups of people to look at each of the items, to look for things like equity and cultural bias, and all of those kinds of things. So that would be what we would like to do. Again, if the legislation changes, then I'll come back to you with a new plan, or the assessment group will come back to you with a new plan. But that's the idea so far. Now, what you will notice is in the new assessment 2021, if you look, just example, look at 5th grade. So you see it has the new assessment. It assesses 3rd through 5th grade standards. You will see that the new standards, the 3rd graders that would then take that in the 5th grade, that's what the dark boxes sort of indicates, that progression of a student through time. Those 3rd graders would not have had the new standards. So what we would intend to do is two things. One, once the standards are adopted, we will go back through and we will look at the old science standards and the new standards that are adopted and see where there are differences. So what was not taught in the old standards that's now in the new standards. So where might those gaps be? The other thing we will do is look to see if those things that were not necessarily taught in the 3rd grade and the old standards are items that get taught again in 4th and 5th grade, because they may very well be, if you recall, I said, cycle back to a lot of the content. So a lot of that might get cycled back to, so we can provide some guidance to schools to say, here's the items that are going to be cycled back to, here's some just additional things you might want to be thinking about as you're cycling back through those items. And then if there are things that are not covered either in the old standards or are not reviewed either in 4th or 5th grade naturally, we'll work with districts and charters and LEAs to come up with a plan for those items. So know that we would never intend to leave people kind of in the lurch without knowing and understanding. I will be very frank with you. The only one where we would have difficulty making that kind of an assessment would be in the high school assessment, because the way the standards are set up, schools and districts can put them together in any kind of 3 courses that they would like to put them together in. So because of that, I'm not going to know if they did pick up those standards or they didn't pick up those standards, but we'll pull together some groups of people to work on that and try to provide the best guidance that we can. Knowing that there's just going to be variability across the high school standards because of the way that because we only have 3 credits. So there you go. I think that's the last one. Yeah. So I can take questions about science before I turn it over to Tammy, or we can go through history and social science, and I'll be back up at the end too. So whatever is your preference.
We'll start with some questions. Thank you very much. Good presentation.
So can we get a comparison of the original standards sort of next to these standards? Because I'm a little, what you said at the very end, I thought that I'd like to see that, because it is a little confusing. And based on some of the input, I sort of want to see, I know they're different, but I want to see how different.
The 2004 standards versus these ones?
Yeah,
we can put something together.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I'll have to think about what that would look like to make it accessible for you.
Easy to digest.
But yes, Member Burton, we can put something.
And I have one more question, and it actually might be for Superintendent, but you can both. I like the inclusivity of the process, and teachers, the teacher part of the community, and the parent groups. But do you have a list of the parent groups? I mean, I kind of have a vague idea of who some of them are, but is it a geographic representation? I mean, I guess I just would like to see who all is involved in that parent voice.
We can certainly. I don't know if it's up on the website. I mean, we can provide the list of people who requested. That was totally voluntary. And as you can imagine, I think it's probably fair to say the response might not have been as broad as it is with our teachers. For the social studies, history, and social sciences, we actually have 2 members here that are here today who helped on one of the meetings that we had. But I will tell you quite frankly, with this and with others, it's been very challenging when we've offered parents opportunities to come in and look at the standards. So I wish we had a way to get 200 or 300 of them in, but we'll provide you the names.
Thank you.
Yeah, and also just to add to that, if I may, and I'm coming back to my last slide, but we're going to try something a little different this time coming around to see if we can't get a few more people from just general public, community, parents, those kinds of things into. So I'll explain that when I come back. Good, thanks.
Thank you. Member Burton, so you've asked for a red line. Is that going to be possible?
Well, red line might not look like a red line, but I think Carol knows what I'm talking about. I just want to see how they compare. I mean,
President Narducci, we can't do a red line because it's completely, it would be all redlined.
Right.
It's a completely different document. But I will try, I think I understand what she would be asking for would be looking at where are different concepts falling now versus where might they be in the new standards.
And if a concept is no longer there, right, and if what's been added, and maybe you can color code those, or...
I will make a promise to do my best on that, and I will let you know what I come up with.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from this side? Member Welborn.
President Narducci, Superintendent Douglas, Dr. Lippert, thank you for your presentation. I just have a few questions around sort of the plan on implementation. Your calendar indicates that your plan is that the board would adopt the standards in the fall of 2018. Can you walk me through a little bit about what happens between today and then, and why it takes another 6 months to get through this process?
Sure. Do you want to just go to the last slide? Might be simpler. I'll just move the last slide up. Is what I'm going to do. Okay. So it does take a little bit of time, Member Welborn and President Narducci. So first thing we would do is, and in fact it is actually open now, and some people have already submitted public comment. Interesting. So we will collect public comments on the draft. It will be open from March 26th through May 28th. It's a 60-day public comment period. It is lengthy public comment period. However, since the standards, both sets of standards are completely new, we wanted to give adequate opportunity for people to really digest them, think about them, provide comments. So that will be open through May 28th. During that time, we will also be engaging with experts in different content areas to provide us with technical review. Their names and biographies are available online if you wanted to see who it is that we are working with for that information. We are also going to be holding, and Member Burton, this may answer your question a little bit. One of the things we're going to do differently is we had collected applications for the parent meetings previously, and realized that for whatever reason that kept people from coming. We tried, right? So we're going to try something different this time. And State Board staff has been fantastic. I can't tell you how great they've been with this. They have offered to allow us to use this room since it does have the live stream capability, and we can record the meeting as well. So for history and social science, we are going to have an in-person meeting on Thursday, April 5th from 3:30 to 5 here. People can watch it live stream, or we will record it. People can watch it later. The idea is that it would be designed specifically for members of the public who maybe don't have, they don't really know that much about standards maybe, or members of the public that just would like a direct conversation with members of the department. So we'll be doing that on Thursday, April 5th, and science we will be doing on Friday, April 6th. So again, those we want to record and make them available, because what we know is that, not everybody in the universe is going to be able to get here from 3:30 to 5, right? But if it's recorded, they can access it online, and they'll have our contact information if they have, questions or want additional information or whatever. They'll be able to contact us then. So our hope is that we will broaden our impact in terms of being able to gather that. So there's that going on. Then after all that is done, so after May 28th, then we need to reconvene our working groups. We are still accepting applications from educators for these, but they're going to have to go back, and they're going to have to look at all of the technical review, and they're going to have to look at all of the public comment, as well as everything that's in the standards, and kind of make some decisions about what to bring back to this board. If there's lots of comment from the technical review and lots of public comment, it might take them a little longer to get through all of that information, because what I can guarantee you is that the working groups do a fantastic job of going through every single comment. And they talk about every single comment, and they think about it from the perspective of, what is the research telling us? They think about it from the perspective of, can this be done in a classroom? Just any number of things. So that takes a little bit of time, and it's the summer, and people are on vacation. So our educators that have been coming have been really fantastic about readjusting their schedules to get in, to help us have a process that's as quick as it can possibly be. However, what we do know is that people go on vacation in the summer times, or they're teaching summer school classes, or any number of things can happen. So sometimes that might make it a little bit longer. We will, I promise you, do it as quickly as we possibly can, because what we know and understand is that our schools would like to have these standards so that they can begin to adjust any curricular resources that they have, so that they can begin to think about, what might this do in terms of any staffing changes that I need to make, or any professional development that I need to put into place for my teachers. So we will bring them back as quick as we can, and that's why I did not put a date as to when we were bringing those back to you, because my hope is as quick as we can, and we'll see how I can, how we get people together, and how much public comment and technical review feedback there is. Honestly, since these are brand new standards, I do anticipate a lot of technical review feedback and a lot of public comment. It's just the nature of the beast, right? We're starting something completely from scratch. Some parts are going to be really great, and other parts are going to need to be rethought. I'm committed to really making sure that whatever we bring before this board is something that is good for kids, and good for educators, and good for our communities. So I can't make you a promise that I can't keep. So does that help, though, kind of see what has to happen between now and when we bring it back to the board?
Yeah. And Mr. President, Member Wellborn, just to give you some perspective, when we went through the last two groups, the English language, arts, and math, there were over 10,000 comments just from the community. So, and every single one of them was entitled to the consideration by the committees.
Okay. Member Wellborn, before we go on, just for a second, I'd like to suggest something, and then see if it's okay. I'd like to suggest that you go through the next standards that you were going to present, and then we would ask questions on the specific standards as necessary, or procedure after that. And then after that's finished, we'll take a 5-minute break. But if you want to ask a question now pertinent to all this, please feel free.
I guess my additional questions really have to do sort of with the timeline and the process. So I had questions about the calendar, and I also have questions about the internal review process. So when would you like to? Let's save that for the end, because it's probably going to be relevant to both standards.
Correct.
So please proceed with the next standards. Oh, sorry, I forgot to look this way.
like to ask a couple questions specific to science. Two of them. One, can you talk just a little bit about what the shift as we look at what the science standards are now and what they are, where we are heading? Can you talk a little bit about what that means for assessment in terms of what kind of assessment students will be taking?
I wish the assessment group was here, Mr. Baker. I do not want to speak out of turn, and honestly, I have not had that conversation with the assessment group to know and understand specifically what the assessment questions may look like, looking at it from a more three-dimensional perspective versus a performance objective. Right. That is certainly something that I can work with the assessment group to provide that answer and come back with more detailed information, but I also don't want to just stand up here and make something up either. So, but we could get you like maybe what a sample of what an assessment item might have looked like and might look like coming up, if that would be helpful. But I honestly can't answer you that question right now.
Well, chances are that actually most students might be taking a test other than the tests that the state might design. Right. So how do these standards line up with the kind of assessments that are currently on the menu?
So at the high school level? Okay.
Sure.
My understanding is that we would be looking mainly at things like SAT science, ACT science, those kinds of assessments. Right. So I have not done an in-depth study of yet. We were just talking about that this morning, Superintendent Douglas and I, that I need to kind of go through and look at what's on those assessments and how they are assessed. What I can tell you is switching to the three-dimensional process versus a performance objective process will be helpful for our students in terms of the SAT and ACT, because what SAT and ACT are asking students to do is to be able to think deeply about science. And so helping them to become better consumers of science, I guess is a way to say it. It will be helpful for them in terms of how well they're able to access it, both SAT and ACT, since it's less, my understanding from a very high level is it's more about, can you sort of read about this science thing and then make some educated statements about what's happening within it. In terms of content, one-to-one content, that I will have to look at and see sort of where we're at content-wise at the high school level. My understanding of what may happen at the elementary school level in terms of science is not good. I can't speak to it because I can't think what the science would be that wouldn't be our statewide assessment for science at the elementary school level. So maybe as we start getting some responses back for the RFP for the menu of assessments, we'll have a better understanding of what might be happening at the elementary school level for science. So, again, I think moving to the 3D perspective will only be helpful to our students in terms of helping them to do well on both SAT and ACT. I imagine, are they looking probably at AP and Cambridge and those kinds of things as well? So we'll just have to see what they decide.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else? Member Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate Member Baker's question. That was one of the questions I had. And when we moved from Ames to AZ Merit, you've heard me express the frustration that I've heard from the field, from the smallest charters to the biggest districts. Lack of preparation material is really bad. The data coming out of it is really bad we're talking AZ Merit. And it doesn't help those teachers improve their curriculum. It doesn't help them understand where their gaps were, because we moved from performance objectives to, the standards. It's more oblique. Mm-hmm. So, and then talking to Dr. Fletcher about, hey, how can we get better data to the field so they can improve their curriculum? If they're going to be rated and graded on these proficiencies, this data better give them the ability to close that gap, and it doesn't. So that's a big concern of mine, is if we're building a whole new platform and we're going to move from the clear Ames framework with all its flaws and warts to this oblique thing that's hardly useful at all. I mean, largely a lot of schools have had to just reinvest in other technologies because they need the data, and they're having to use extra money and resources because AZ Merit has pretty much left them in the cold. So that's a very, very important question, that before we go and put some standards out in the field, we need to know what the assessments are, how they're going to set our teachers up for success. I mean, the Ames test right now, with all its warts and flaws, does give good data to those science teachers right now to be able to do some continuous improvement work, and there's better prep material. So I appreciate you bringing that up. I did have a couple of other questions, Mr. President, on, this is science, so we're talking about evidence, and you're pointing out a couple of pretty big changes philosophically here. So let me just ask one of them here. Moving off the scientific method to the science and engineering process, have other states used that? What are we seeing in the field in terms of how that's actually upping our game in science education? Can you share a little bit about some of the evidence there? And
I would say, as a science and STEM educator, and one who actually is a STEM researcher now, doing a lot of research, I would say that the science and engineering practices really reflect what real scientists and engineers actually do, and that's really what we want for our kids, not to follow a lockstep method, sort of like a first do this, then do this, because that's not real science. Mm-hmm. And so I think you'll see, if you look closely at the practices, you will see all those familiar steps, so to speak, that we all grew up with, and that poster hanging in the classroom, Mm-hmm. So I think you'll see that. We all want to start with that sense of wonder and observation and, students asking questions, because that's really what gets to solving problems and things. And I just wanted to read an excerpt that really resonates with, I think, Superintendent Douglas's desire for citizens. I mean, that's really our goal of education. I would say in science education, that's really our ultimate goal, too, is to raise up an informed citizenry. I mean, if you look at any of the headlines, it's science and technology all over the place. And so this is a little passage from the Framework for K-12 Science Education. So the overarching goal for K-12 science education is to ensure that by the end of 12th grade, all students have some appreciation of the beauty and wonder of science, possess sufficient knowledge of science and engineering to engage in public discussions on related issues, are careful consumers of scientific and technological information related to their daily lives, are able to continue to learn about science outside of school, and have the skills to enter careers of their choice, including but not limited to careers in science, engineering, and technology. And so I would say, going back around to your question, is really what kind of test or whatever is, I really think of, I guess my role as a teacher is really to teach my students how to think and how to, so when they know how to think, they'll know how to, attack a problem or address a situation or come up with a solution. And so providing students with engaging opportunities, such as I believe the 3D approach really does, is to experience how science is really done. And so I don't know how this will be reflected, but just some observations from an educator standpoint.
Thank you.
So have there been states that already have moved to this type of science education?
Yes, quite a number have.
What have they seen in terms of performance and?
On their statewide assessments and things like that. I have not delved into their data to look at their statewide assessment data. It's certainly something we can look at, but I have not delved into their data. Can I just address the science assessment just quickly? Do you mind? So, Member Taylor, what I would say to you is that I think we've learned a lot from AZ Merit, right? And so we have a great opportunity now, as we're thinking about a new science assessment, to learn from what we found out about AZ Merit as we're developing an RFP to make sure that whatever is in that contract with the assessment provider is reflective of the things that districts need to see. So I'll just say that we'll definitely use this as an opportunity to say, we learned something, and how can we get better as we go along? And that's, I think it was in the very first slide, but everything about what we do needs to be a continuous improvement process. So if we are learning that something didn't go well the first round, I sincerely hope that we will be taking that knowledge and taking that learning and using it to make things better as we move forward. So thank you for your insights into that, and I will definitely share them with our assessment group as we're moving forward.
Yeah, thank you. And I'd love to see other results from other states, as they've made this switch, and
sure.
how that might help us understand this. And Mr. President, I do have one last question here. One of the other big changes is, with the big ideas, effectively we're going to be learning less content, but going deeper in that content. We have the areas there, and that was similar to the transition in the prior standards review. So that's not really a new thing, but how do we know that, and you got to learn to think, but you got to learn to think with something, right? Some basic facts, some basic content, right? So how do we know we have the right balance in terms of enough content that's going to give us the ability to think and process and draw conclusions, based on good content that we've learned? How do you know that we have struck the right balance there?
Yeah, Member Taylor, I think what I would say too is I don't believe there actually is less content in here. I think what is happening with the big ideas is rather than less content, it's organized content. So that as we are studying a particular thing, that we've really thought through how does that content all come together in an organized whole versus learn a little bit here and then a little bit here and a little bit here and then we'll come back to it here. So there's that progression. So and as I work on the sort of comparison from the 2004 standards, I think what we will see is that there's not less content. It's just organized in a more logical kind of manner.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Member Taylor. Anybody else on this side? I'm going to go back to Member Wellborn and just see if she wants to.
Yeah, on further reflection, I think my question is specific to science. So going back to the calendar, and I apologize, I was not involved when the prior standards, English and math, were developed, so I'm not familiar with the process. But I noticed that in the calendar plan that we for state for SY 1920. The plan is that there would be new standards that would be assessed with an old test. And is there any way to avoid that? Because I can hear the outcry now of that. And what would have to happen for us to avoid a situation where we're doing that?
Yeah, Member Wellborn, if you look at the third or fourth white bullet there, ADE explores options under ESSA for possible waiver of science assessment in school year 1920. So right now the requirement for 3 years of science assessment is required in the Every Student Succeeds Act, that we have to do that. So if we want to waive that for 1920, we do need to get the permission of the federal government. So we will be asking for that permission to not have to assess with an old assessment while we're teaching new standards. We agree that
the intent is to get a waiver for that year. I didn't understand
Correct.
it.
Yes,
okay.
That's the intent, so that we don't get into that exact situation. Yes.
Okay. I'm also curious about the comment that was made about in the internal review process. I mean, I appreciate you brought so many experts together in science, and then you ended up with a draft last fall that apparently didn't meet your own internal standards of what was required, and specifically the scientific method was mentioned that it wasn't in there. Can you talk about some of the things that were in the draft back after the working groups had completed their work, and what were the holes that the department found that needed that you were working on for the last few months and added into the draft?
Mm-hmm. Superintendent, do you want to take that? You want me to take that?
I think that question might be better held till the end because it actually impacted both areas. Okay. And I'm not sure. I think, in my opinion, it impacted history and social sciences probably more than science. So,
give or take.
Okay,
So
I'll be happy to table.
Okay.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and proceed with the next.
Okay. Thank you.
Standards.
Good morning, President Narducci, Superintendent Douglas, and members of the State Board. My name is Tammy Waller, and I'm the Director for K-12 Social Studies and World and Native Languages. And I'll be presenting the work that was done on the History and Social Science draft. Before I begin, I just want to say a thank you to the social studies educators who gave up their precious time with students and their breaks to do this work. Many of them are here in the room today. I also want to thank the administrators at the site and district level for allowing their teachers to have release time to do this important work and the K-12 standards unit. So just like the science standards, the history and social science standards started out with working groups, and we had 86 educators who met over the period of a year, and they were representing 54 districts, charter schools, and institutions of higher education. We had 11 charter schools represented, and we had 7 institutes of higher education. In addition, we also had some support and input from the Arizona Geographic Alliance when we were working specifically on the geography strands, and from the Arizona Council on Economic Education to help us with our effort to really bump up the financial literacy and economic standards based on the public feedback we had received. That's okay. I can't talk that fast. Yeah. Okay. So when we started the process, we were tasked, the working groups were tasked to create standards and move away from a checklist of POs. We were told that these standards were Arizona standards for Arizona children by Arizona educators. And we also based our decisions on research, the expertise of the working group members as educators, and the public feedback that we received on the 2005 standards. There is a plethora of research about history and social sciences from all sorts of different groups and organizations. And some of the research that we looked towards, we started off with the Bradley Commission Report on History in the Schools in 1988, which was the premier piece of research on history education. We also looked at other national reports like the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, which ranks state history standards, to look at our standards from when we did our last standards review and the one prior, and looking at different gaps that they had recommended be fixed. We looked at reports on history education. We looked at the Guardian of Democracy Civic Mission of the Schools report, the U.S. History, Civics, Geography, and Economics frameworks from the NAEP. In addition to that, content organizations also have their own research. We looked at standards through the National History Standards. We looked at the National Financial Literacy Standards, the Geographic Learning Framework, the National Standards for Civics and Government, the National Social Studies Standards, and the C3 Framework for College, Career, and Civic Life. And then we also broadened our research even more. We looked at the advanced placement research and frameworks for the social sciences, and we looked at other states who had recently adopted standards to look for trends in structure to help us in that process. We also looked at scholarly articles from publications and, of course, the public feedback and the expertise of the individuals who came to the working groups. One of the consistent pieces of public feedback on our old standards were that they lacked coherence. Especially parents felt that they didn't understand what their students were learning at each of the grade levels in the history and social sciences. Teachers were frustrated because in first grade, students might learn about the American Revolution and Mesopotamia that same year, discrete pieces of information with no connection. So one of the things that the working group did is they came together and they decided to create themes in focus for K through 8th grade. And that way, all students in all schools in Arizona would have the same equal opportunity to learn that information, because we're a transient population here in Arizona. And we wanted to make sure that students who moved from school to school district would have a consistent focus or theme. So we started out with kindergarten, and we had our content experts at the grade levels really work on this theme and focus. So in kindergarten, we started out with that concept of children as citizens. And one thing that's important to understand is in every grade level from K through 8th grade, There are strong history standards and background, strong civics focus and background, strong geographical focus, and strong economic and financial literacy. We moved on to first grade, where we looked at our communities and living and working together. Second grade, students had their first taste of that world kind of history and geography with the world around me. We have Arizona Studies. Fourth grade looked at regions and cultures of the Americas. Fifth grade was United States Studies. Sixth grade was Global Studies, World Regions and Cultures. And seventh grade was Contemporary Global Studies. Starting in seventh and eighth grade, we looked at United States history as part of the context of the world as a whole, because time period-wise, that's the point at the turn of the century where the United States begins to become more of a global power and becomes more involved in global trade. And then eighth grade, we brought it back to citizenship and civic engagement, where students would also have a strong historical background in founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the beginnings of our Constitution, and then how does that Constitution apply today to students? We wanted them to start looking at themselves as actors within their societies and communities. We wanted something that made sense and was responsive to the public feedback. So the storyline gives an overall scope and sequence of the history and social science content for those grade levels. High school is a little bit different because we have graduation requirements by statute. So every one of the LEAs puts together their own courses based on the high school standards. We have three components to our standards. One of the components is the inquiry, or the why. One of the things that the research was showing is that students who were receiving social science education, but they weren't retaining their history or their civics, they weren't retaining the information. And part of that had to do with the idea of current research talking about doing the work of a historian, doing the work of a geographer. So just like science, we wanted students to be able to take the content and the skills and to start to examine historical problems, geographical issues. We wanted them to be able to do financial literacy, as if looking at the different components that a financial analyst would look at, political science, economics. So the inquiry, basically, we have inquiry elements. So at each grade level, there's inquiry elements that can be used with the content. So basically what the inquiry elements do is they have the students form questions, gather and interpret evidence, create claims and analyze counterclaims, and then communicate the results. And this was a really important part of the standards according to the committee members, because in the past we've had these disciplinary literacy standards where students would read, write, speak, and listen as in the social sciences. Those standards are now part of the inquiry process. So it matches up perfectly to the skills that the ELA standards have. The next part of our standards were the hows and the what, and those are translated into what we call big ideas. We have a set of disciplinary skills and processes, and that's the how. How do you look at data in economics? How do you analyze trends in geography? How do you compare historical events? How do you look at evidence? So the disciplinary skills and processes are one part, and then the what, the content specifically, is divided into the disciplines of civics, economics, geography, and history. And we have 21 big ideas, and those big ideas are on page 12 in the standards in a chart. And within those big ideas, we have processes and skills, and we also have 4 content areas. The standards for each grade level are written under the umbrella of the big ideas. And all 21 big ideas appear in each grade band, but not necessarily at each grade level. Storylines start out the standards for each grade level, which focus on the scope and sequence of the content, and key concepts and ideas provide support and guidance for curriculum development and assessment. One thing that's important to remember about the standard is it's the end result of what the student should do. Teachers and educators then break down that standard. And when breaking down that standard, they teach students what's the background knowledge needed, what are the different areas, what are the steps it takes to get to the end result, which is the standard. So they scaffold their lessons. So here's a little peek at the big ideas. We start out with the disciplinary skills and processes, or the how. So students are looking at chronological reasoning and the difference between historical periods and between the past and the present. So for a kindergartner or first grader, that might look like using terms like present, past, putting events of their life on a timeline. Once they get into older grades, that looks like comparing what's happening in different regions of the world at the same time, looking for similarities and differences. Historical thinking involves the ability to identify, compare, and evaluate multiple perspectives about a given event and to draw conclusions because there are multiple points of view. The third one is looking at historical sources, and it's not just having students look at primary and secondary sources, but being able to source them, to evaluate them, to look for bias. We want them to be strong thinkers. We want them to be able to look through all of the social media that they get and all of the information that's coming through, and we want them to be able to use information to develop claims about the past and answer historical, economic, geographic, and political questions. And finally, cause and effect is our third skill and process, to look at the relationship between causes and effects through history, geography, economics, and civics. Okay, so civics. At each grade level, there are civics standards and there are civics big ideas. And when we came up with the big ideas, what the educators did is they looked at what do we teach in these areas, what do we think students need to know, what does the research say students need to know, and then the committee members went ahead and they said, now can we see similarities? Can we organize these into ideas? And they came up with the big ideas for the discipline areas. So the content descriptors for the big ideas are on page 5 of the document. So we have 4 big ideas in civics. Economics, our first big idea is financial literacy, which is in each grade band. And then we have 4 other big ideas. Both personal economic and public policy. We want students to be able to understand personal economics and how to apply economics to their daily life, but we also want them to understand economic concepts so they can make decisions about public policy and different viewpoints. Geography is more than identifying things on a map. We want students to be able to use tools and representations to understand their world. We want them to understand how interactions are affected. We want them to look at movement, to understand the past, present, and future conditions, and global interconnections and spatial patterns. And the study of geography really enhances how students understand history, civics, and economics. And then finally, history. One thing you'll notice about the history big ideas is they're not divided into United States history and world history. These big ideas can take the content of United States history and the content of world history and be applied to both. So we wanted students to look at the development of civilizations, societies, cultures, and innovations, and how it influenced history, but also the modern world, because we felt like that was missing a lot from our previous standards. Students are always asking, well, so what? How does this impact me? So what's the connection to you as a student, as a member of society? We were looking at cycles of conflict and cooperation, economic, political, and religious ideas and institutions that influence history and, again, continue to shape the modern world so they understand what's happening in the news. Patterns of social, political interactions have shaped people, places, and events throughout history and continue to shape the modern world. So a student in world history would take these big ideas and the standards would apply to if they were studying World War I from a European perspective. They would also apply to the study of American history. So how does it work together? We have three basic components in our standards. We have the why, which is our inquiry elements, which are a sequence of questions, student use of evidence, and coming up with conclusions. The how, which is the disciplinary skills and practices. How do you read a document? How do you analyze cause and effect? And then the big ideas and the standards, which are the content. And they are very content rich in terms of what students can know and understand. So I wanted to give you an example of how this would work. If you look in your document on page 32, we have our 6th grade standards. And the 6th grade is looking at world regions and cultures of the Eastern Hemisphere. So what we've decided to do, one of the big content pieces in this historical time frame is the idea of the growth of trade networks and the impacts of trade when various cultures come together because of technology. So the 6th grade examples on the Black Death. So you start out with your inquiry, your question. So the students might look at how did the Black Death affect people in the 14th century? The inquiry element would be gathering relevant information from primary and secondary sources using origin and authority of the source to guide the selection. Disciplinary skills and processes, they'll look at analyzing connections among events and developments in various geographical and cultural contexts. And they're going to organize applicable evidence into a coherent argument about the past. And the big idea. The big idea is global interconnections and spatial patterns are a necessary part of geographic reasoning. And the standard would be to describe how natural and human-made catastrophic events and economic activities affect people living in nearby and distant places. Since 6th graders are studying the Eastern Hemisphere, they're studying the coming together of European and Asian societies with trade routes, the Black Death would be an example that would be used to illustrate that. So what might it look like in a classroom? So the students would have a task, like using sources, create an annotated illustration depicting how the Black Death affected different groups of people in the 14th century. There would be featured sources. There would be statistics on the bubonic plague to help support mathematics skills. There would be an illustration of the persecution of the Jews during the Black Death. And then there'd be an informational text, 2 primary sources and then an informational text, the social and economic effects of the plague. So students then would take that information and they would come up with the communication of their conclusion of how different groups were impacted. And this is just an example. The teacher in me is like always bring student work to show. And an example from the field of how students could communicate that result. So this is how the standards could be taught. And it's up to teachers individually then to unwrap the standards and choose the method that they would teach them. So the one thing, one of the things about the standards, it does offer the educators in the classroom who know their students best ways to use their curriculum and instruction to teach these standards and to scaffold them. So there were 4 major changes in the standards, actually 5 major changes. So the first was the shifting from performance objectives to broader standards to allow greater depth and more connection. And I would have to agree with Carol. I think the social studies standards are more content-rich than our old standards, which many teachers and the public feedback felt were disjointed and were rushed to check off things. And we used to have a saying that we were expected to go from Plato to NATO in 1 year. And we couldn't get good, deep instruction with the students at that point. And that was reflected time and time again with the working group and the public feedback. Also, by shifting to these big ideas, students can understand how things are interrelated and they have more context to what's happening in the social sciences and history. The second thing we did is we organized the standards around the 21 big ideas. the coherence, the depth, and the rigor. Prior to this, we had our old standards had 5 strands, up to 10 concepts per strand, and then a plethora of performance objectives. And these were small, disjointed. It was very difficult to teach these in a meaningful way. And a lot of the K-8 feedback specifically talked about with the emphasis on the other disciplines, with testing. It was very difficult to be able to do meaningful social science instruction. The third is we wanted to connect social studies content with disciplinary skills, so students would be able to do the work of historians and social scientists, economic data, use economic data, and do the work of an economist. We wanted them to be able to process it, to have meaning for them, so they would be able to remember it and apply it. Because one of the questions I get a lot as the director of social studies is, why don't we have social studies standards? Why don't our kids learn history? And if you look at the old standards, we have a lot of standards, but because of the way they were organized and the tiny grain size of the performance objectives, teachers had a hard time making it stick with the students. We also added financial literacy in each grade band. We had a lot of public feedback about the fact that students really needed to learn personal economics. And although they were in the old standards, they weren't really emphasized as much. So we made a commitment to strengthen our financial literacy at each grade band and introduce it as early as kindergarten for students to start talking about choices and savings and things like that. And then finally, we created coherent storylines for K-8 because there was just concern about the disjointed nature of it, especially at the 7th and 8th grade. We received a lot of public feedback in the 7th and 8th grade about the standards because they were out of order. They had a lot of content area that didn't seem to make sense together. So taking all these into account, the committee put together the social science and history standards based around the idea of the big ideas. Get thirsty up here. Thank you. So, questions, sorry. This is my first time.
Can we do this for a second? Thank you very much. You did great. We're going to take a break and then come back with questions. This gives members time to think about their questions, and we'll reconvene at 11:15.
Thank you.
change was for...
We have 1 minute before we reconvene. What's that? $11:15, so we are going to reconvene. Do we need to do a roll call?
I guess.
Okay, we're good. All right, we'll continue on. Thank you for the presentations. We'll go directly into questions if there are any further questions. And we'll start from Member Burton and rotate to my left.
Well, my questions have more to do with the process. And we heard a couple of comments about how much the standards changed and the internal review process, and I think I got some of those answered, but moving forward, will that be more of an open process, and how, or is internal review really just typos and organization and corrections, or is it substance?
I'll be glad to answer that. The internal review process was not just typos. It was taking a deep look at in my opinion, of what the recommendation was from the working groups. And I give you some examples, and I would say history is my stronger suit, but in the time that I've been in office, you probably know we created the We Are Listening tours. I've done over almost 60 town halls in 3 years around this state, and probably more than I even heard complaints about Common Core and math and English language. I hear concerns from the parents, communities, grandparents, John Q, taxpayer, whoever they are, and it was alluded to up here. Why don't our children understand history? Why don't our children understand whatever it wants to be, our founding fathers, how many states we have in the Union, what those states actually are. And so this work was brought forward, and actually it was on the board agenda almost by a miscue in December. It was just a placeholder, and we really, in my opinion, weren't done with the work. So at that point in time, I was presented with the draft standards, and when I saw in those standards that, and I want to say this carefully because I don't want anyone to think I have a disrespect for the work they do or did, but when things were so vague, in my opinion, that almost anything could be taught. And what I saw lacking in these standards was that you could read a standard, and I'll give you an example. One of the original kindergarten standards for history was explain key American symbols, traditions. What does that mean? That could be different in every single kindergarten classroom throughout the state. Standards, in my opinion, are the what a child, we are laying out our expectations of what we expect our children to know. And when they can be anything to anybody, then they're not really standards and they're not an expectation, in my opinion. We had, and Member Taylor alluded to this before, that, when you talk about critical thinking, and it seems to me that we as the big we, not just here in Arizona, we as a society seem to define critical thinking more as problem solving. Well, critical thinking is discerning the truth. How do you discern the truth if you don't have information from which to discern it? Why would you ask what the planets are if you don't even know that planets exist? And I'm not saying that that was missing from those particular standards, but we had, and I think I flipped it, put a little dog ear on this one. You know, there was a standard, I think this is in 5th grade, voting in an election. I'm taking just a snippet out of it. Voting in elections, running for office, working on campaigns. Well, there was nowhere in the standards that it even explained what are political parties, what are they made of, how are they made of. Again, the president's electoral college, the 3 branches of government, clearly an expectation that these are explained in a way that that would be very forthcoming. What are the different forms of government? You know, with all due respect to every single teacher out there, if one more teacher comes up to me and calls our country a democracy, I think I just might scream, because we're not. We're a republic. And if we're throwing those terms around very flippantly, then in my opinion, we're not educating our children properly. So to know what their rights are, to know why we protect our rights and all these sort of things. So yes, the internal review process is new. As I said before, this is the first time since I've been superintendent that I've actually been able to determine to some degree what the process would be. And when I read through them, I was not happy in many, and much of it is amazing. But I thought we really need to define some of these expectations. So I've just given you a few quick examples, but that's what the internal process was. How do you, and we worked with our standards group. We didn't, just arbitrarily say this, that, and the other thing. We had a pretty much an executive team working with the standards to take a look and what do we think a lot. But how do you externalize an internal process? And to say that that has to go away, with all due respect, I would not bring to this board standards. And I think we still have work to do. I think we heard it in the public comments today. As far as especially as far as the history, how do we make sure that our children understand this? The impact within the world. I could go on and on and on and on. But I'm not going to bring anything here under my name and my title, especially when work on standards was one of the things I was elected to this office to do.
Superintendent Douglas, I understand that. I'm just looking actually at I understand the first internal review is more the last internal review. It looks like there's in this standards development process, there's another internal review. And my question about content, substance, and I certainly understand where you're coming from. Will there be another opportunity before they're approved for public comment? And this clearly is an iterative process because it's, you're making some substantial changes that based on input from the community. So my question is just on that last step. Will there be that last internal review? Is that something that will be open for public comment before we're actually voting on them?
I would hope by the time we get to that last internal review, but again, it falls into the same category that I'm not going to bring something to this board that I don't think is in the best interest of our students in the community we should be serving. So let's take a hypothetical. I don't know. Let's say in the science we decide there's 6 planets instead of, I don't know. That's not even a good example. I can't think of an example.
May I just...
But let's say something's blatantly false that has somehow come through in there. I'm not going to bring it to the board.
Yeah, and to add to what Superintendent Douglas has said, in the past, what we have done is if we bring them back to the board for final adoption, and there has been significant amount of change between what you saw as the draft and what you're now seeing in front of you to adopt, There has always been that option of having another round of public comment if we feel that that is needed. The other thing that I will just tell you that I have learned, and I think that as we move forward, is, in the past when we've worked with other superintendents, it's been more of a formality when we bring it to them. They're like, okay, looks good, check, bring it forward. And what I now understand is that Superintendent Douglas, and rightfully so, and actually I think in a very good way, wants to be involved in a more granular level than previous superintendents have been involved. So what my intent is, as we're moving through this next set of processes, is rather than saving it all to the very end, we'll be talking throughout the entire process. So the internal review, rather than happening in December, or in this case, when we're done with whenever the drafts would be done, they would be stretched out, and we would be having these conversations all along so that we can make sure that what we're doing as a standards group and what Superintendent Douglas is hearing when she's out doing all of her listening tours are jiving and meshing and moving forward in a very, I think, nice manner and in a clear manner as we move forward. So that would be the other thing. But I think it's also important that she needs to be able to support whatever we bring forward, and that's super important. She was elected to be the superintendent of public instruction, and as such, she's got to make sure that she is respecting what she's hearing from the public as she's out there doing it. So.
Well, and Mr. President, if I can make one more comment. Here, I think even here today, we've heard part of the challenge of that is, we're trying to get a set of standards for our children that we all agree upon, but yet we've heard two different pieces of it that one say, no, only the education professionals should really be involved with it, and another side of it that says, sometimes what they come up with isn't really what we believe as a community that is the direction we want for our children necessarily. So I'm not sure how we make everybody happy in this situation. I know our guiding principle has always been keep kids first and try to do what's in their best interest, but I'm not sure how we reconcile those. So you can just ponder that until the fall.
Thank you. Thank you, Member Burton. I think Member Mack has a comment.
Yeah, so just to build on what has been said already, I think I appreciate the last comment about how the internal review will happen in a cyclical way throughout the process, and that helps to alleviate some of my concern. I think so much has been done from the department standpoint to make the process transparent, especially with making the public feedback public on the website. It's been great to see all those comments posted up there, to make all the meetings public, to live stream the public feedback that's coming up in April. I think all these transparency measures are great, and I think they're going to do a lot to boost that public perception of the whole standards process, which, as Superintendent Douglas alluded to earlier, has been a rocky road at times and had controversial. And so I would think in the best interest of keeping that transparency all the way through the process in order to alleviate any controversy or that might arise throughout the line is to make that transparency complete. I have no issues with an internal review. If that is, I think, the department's prerogative, and it's great that Superintendent Douglas wants to be involved. But I think in order to boost that transparency with the internal review process, perhaps, and I feel like as a state board, we do need to answer to the working groups, those more than 100 educators representing 13 out of 15 counties, plus the public feedback. And I would say what I saw today was a great balance of both. I think over and over again in the presentation, I was about to start a tally count of how many times I heard it, but the presentation over and over again, according to public feedback, based on public feedback, based on public feedback, over and over again was what I heard from the department. So I do feel we are being transparent as far as that goes, and I do feel there is a public voice in this, along with the content experts and the educators. So I do think there is built into the process a tremendous amount of balance, and I just think that final thing would be if, and I requested this 2 months ago at the board meeting, is just a copy of that November draft, and then post internal review, and then again the same for this time around. But I anticipate this time around it will probably be pretty much the same, given that the internal review is happening cyclically, but just I feel like that final little thing, dotting that I, crossing that T, would really help that public perception to ensure that the version the board is seeing is truly reflective of not only the educators and content experts, but also the public review and feedback, and that, and I know how that goes, every single public comment is accounted for, literally, and what we do is we literally, when Carol was saying that, it's not an exaggeration, to go through every single one and literally identify how are we going to address it. Is it addressable? Because sometimes the quote, quote, feedback is not a feedback, but a complaint, or I don't know, or a compliment for that matter, and it's not actionable. And so feedback must be actionable. And so taking all that into account is what I would, just my little suggestion, proposal, to complete that cycle of transparency that the department has already done a great job of doing.
Well, and Mr. President, to Member Mack's comments, this has been some of the most transparent, even with how challenging the English language and math was. The process has been very transparent. What we provided to the board today, wherever I put those, we put them in black and white just because it's easier to read that way. But we also have a version, and I think it's up on the website, is it, or it can be, it will be, that is a version where this is the work that the working group submitted as is, and then we have, I think in green or red or whatever color it may be, a version that shows what came from the internal review process. So we have everything there ever could possibly be, no matter how and where and when the information was gathered. Again, we did it this way just because we felt it was easier to read. But that is available, and it will be available to board members if you want to see it also.
Thank you. Member Welborn.
I think she read.
Oh, no, perfect. And then I was just going to add one little thing. I think that little final piece of internal review coming straight to the state board, I personally would feel a lot better if after that internal review it went through the working groups again, since they were the ones that directly addressed all the public feedback. I don't necessarily believe another round of public feedback needs to take place. We've already had one round prior to the standards, and we have another round now, and I believe, I have comments maybe that I'll put out there, but at this point, but I believe public feedback is more than enough, but I believe building on, I know Member Burton suggested maybe something else coming in after the internal review. I believe to hold to the integrity of the process and to honor the work of the working groups and the hours of that they spend traveling and working on these and being selected by the department themselves to represent, content expertise. I feel like that would be just a nice conclusion to the cycle, but.
Member Welborn.
Thank you, President Narducci, Superintendent Douglas. I would like to ask a question about in the science standards, you indicated there's sort of essential standards and then standards plus. And I just wanted to, not being an educator, and just understand how do you interpret that would translate into actual courses that high schools would offer for their students and the menu of assessment that we're going to be implementing?
So, yes, Member Welborn, yes, at the high school level we have essential standards and we have plus standards. So the essential standards are designed to allow schools to determine how they would like to cover those standards. So they are in the areas of earth and space science, in the area of physical science, which would include both chemistry and physics, and, of course, life sciences. So there's a lot of different ways they can attack that, how they would like to do it. So some may want to offer maybe a chem physics combined. Some might want to offer, it's very easy to access, I think, the earth and space science standards through chemistry, physics, and life sciences. So there's a number of different ways that they can do that. And then the plus standards would be for those additional courses beyond the essential. So I can't give you a one way to do it. There's lots.
Am I correct in understanding that it's pretty common in high school to offer physics, chemistry, and biology, and that those are the most common science courses that students take?
And Earth and Space.
Earth and Space quite
Earth
a bit.
and Space,
too.
okay.
Yes.
So they have 4 options. So do you see that changing with the new set of standards, or I know we don't specify in the graduation requirements what coursework they take. We just say they need 3 science courses.
Correct.
But do you envision there being where I'm getting to is whether you're thinking that districts will design sort of the biology plus class and then the regular biology class. Are you thinking that's how it might be tackled, or?
Member Wilburn, I think what I would see changing at the high school level is this idea that they should be teaching something from Earth and Space, something from physical, and something from life sciences. So I don't know if that's necessarily a change for all districts. It may be a change for some districts or some high schools because many are offering those already. So, and then the 4th credit, most high schools are offering some sort of an advanced biology, some sort of an advanced chemistry or physics, some sort of, even in these standards, they will have guidance on how to offer a advanced or 4th credit of Earth and Space. So I think, I don't know what they're all offering now, so it's hard to say definitively that yes, it'll change, no, it won't change. But I do think that these standards offer really good guidance on how can you look at the different discipline areas and include them into the high school curriculum.
Thank you.
Thank you, Member Wilburn. Thank you for the answer. Member Mack?
President Narducci.
Member K.
It's all right. Yeah. Thank you. President Narducci, Superintendent Douglas, members of the board. Actually, my request was going to be similar to Member Mack's in that we see some sort of version with track changes from the November draft to current and then throughout the process. Sounds like it has already been addressed, so very much looking forward to seeing those. The part that I wasn't going to request, however, just for the record, would like to state Member Mack's request that final draft go to the working group prior to coming before the board again. I definitely support that request, so I'd just like to state that for the record. Thank you.
So, President Narducci, that creates perhaps an interesting conundrum because I'm going to bring to the board what I'm satisfied with. So hypothetically, suppose we get it in a good place and we make some changes and we take it back to the working group and I don't know, we're not going to teach those planets anymore. I would not bring that to the board. I would be very glad to show if there would be any changes after an internal review from all the work that's been done, and I think the yeoman's part of the work has been done. I don't imagine it would be that much. I'd be glad to track those changes, and then maybe the board say, yes, we accept them, no, we don't. But, this could go on forever and ever and ever, and we're already having concerns about will we meet timelines and things, especially for science, for the assessment.
President Narducci, Superintendent Douglas, thank you. As long as we have a process where we're hearing that feedback again from the working group and the board is made aware of those concerns along with your recommendation, I am comfortable with that, and I would like to say I appreciate that, the willingness on your part. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Kay. Superintendent Douglas, do you want anything else? Can I skip over you, go the rest, and then, because there's interaction. Okay. Vice President Corr.
President Narducci, one of the dangers of sitting on your left apparently today is many of the good ideas have already been brought up. So I would just echo support for seeing very, with track changes or whatever else, whatever came about from the initial internal review. And then echoing an earlier comment, just the concern about timing, making sure we're giving our teachers enough time for curriculum development, professional growth, training, material selection, so on and so forth. So, maybe next month we'll start on your left, right? And I'll have a good idea for
you. And I'll ignore the right. Thank you. Member Mack.
I would echo Member Kay's sentiments just now that we do appreciate getting all versions available to us. And we feel, just as you do, Superintendent Douglas, just as strongly that our students get the very best standards, and we have all the information in front of us to make that decision, because it is a board action item. So we'll need to be voting on what is best for kids.
Thank you. Member Baker. Thank you. Member Taylor.
Thank you, President. I don't want to extend the meeting here a little bit, but I'm excited about some of the things coming forward. The financial literacy items and standards, I think, are great. So good work on that. I know a lot of schools have put in a lot of things, so hopefully they'll all be aligned, because it's nice to have the creativity in the field as well. I will tell you a couple just general initial observations. There does seem a feel like it is nudging curriculum here, and we're crossing that line a little bit. So I would just encourage you, as you work with the working group, is stay out of that purview. That's the LEA's purview. You know, when we talk about themes and focus, right, some LEAs like to teach history chronologically, right, rather than around themes or things like that. We need to make sure that they have that flexibility to do that. Maybe that's already in there, and if it is, that's great. Sounds like you're nodding, so I think that's great. It needs to be explicit, that they know that they have that flexibility. They don't have to go redo things. I think sometimes when they feel this nudge from these documents, then they have to go redo all their curriculum, and that drives costs, and if that's unnecessary, then let's make sure that that's really well communicated.
Yeah, Member Taylor, just to respond quickly to that, yes, that guidance is already in the standards. We can certainly make it more prevalent.
Yeah,
okay, good.
It does talk about, in the very beginning, in the introductions, it says that the content can be taught regionally, it can be taught chronologically, it can be taught any different way that the LEAs would like to do that.
Okay, good. Let me take it to another aspect here that maybe they have flexibility, maybe they don't. The articulated standards, grade levels have to do this. That's something when we had a preview of this in the fall, I expressed some concerns about having grade levels, and here's a couple of reasons why. There's some schools that have advanced curriculums, and they need that flexibility to teach those at earlier grades. And some of you are aware that whole issue was litigated, and the court says, yeah, why are we holding students back? So we need to make sure that schools, again, have that, because that's a curricular element, saying you have to teach it at these particular grade levels. And so that's something that I want to make sure that we're really clear with the field as well, is that maybe this is guidance that generally, but if you want to advance or reorganize these, as long as you're hitting these standards, that's really where the state needs to draw the line, is we're identifying the here's what needs to be taught and how you do it. There could be some innovation in the field that we don't want to stifle through, all the contextual information around the standards. And that articulation is one of those that the courts have actually weighed in on, that I think is important for us to be aware of as we generate this document. So anyways, wanted to, again, bring that up again. I brought it up once. I want to bring it up again because that's important for a lot of schools. And then I'm not going to repeat what Member Mack says. I agree. I appreciate those comments. I think that's great. I think it's important as a board. Statutory language says we adopt standards, right? So we have an ownership piece in this, and the department is indispensable in our duty there. But if we feel that we need a little bit more time, we need to take it. It's on us ultimately to adopt those standards. So those comments I think are really good, and we'll adopt them when we're comfortable with them. And Carol, thank you for your team and your staff and all the good work that you've done here. There's lots of good things. One thing, the last thing, President Narducci, that I would like to see in the history standards is just clear emphasis on the American exceptionalism. Sometimes it can be lost in the context. And sometimes, and I've seen some of those artifacts, Superintendent, you've touched on it already, but I think as clear and explicit as we could make it, I think is a benefit to the field. When these standards are simple, in a list, and clear and concise, then you're not having all these trainers try to read our minds and come up with things. And certainly that's a foundational element of the history standards, is teaching of our country and the great role that it has. So as explicit as we can be in those particular areas, I think it'll benefit our field. So thank you, President.
Thank you. Superintendent Douglas, anything else?
Okay. Just before, a couple of comments I just want to make. To Mr. Member Taylor's point, I have always believed that, the legislature says we must teach Arizona college and career ready standards. I believe schools have always had the ability, or districts, to go above and beyond whatever those may be. And I was trying to find out some information from a comment that you made before about schools not getting the data that they had in the past. The data is driven more by the contract with AIR, which is the contract that this board set. And just to be clear, that contract was set without any input from ADE. I know my team has been very proactive about when districts had questions about not receiving information or not quite knowing how to interpret it, because it looks a little different than how it was provided under Ames. We've been very proactive in doing that and making sure they can understand the data they get. The other question was, and I want to see if I'm getting an answer to this. Well, I thought the test prep materials were also more driven by that contract. We refresh it if we update. One of the things that we've been trying to do and have done is have a committee that checks questions for socioeconomic appropriateness, making sure there's no political intent within questions and things like that. When we do that, we make sure that that information is provided out also.
Thank you. We've had a good discussion on this for almost 2 hours now, and I think that goes to how important we feel the standards are and what good work has been accomplished by everybody involved, and how important the board feels that stakeholder involvement is in the process as well. And I look at it from a very simplistic view. Anybody who watches Fox knows Water's World, and sometimes how embarrassing it is that these people down on Wall Street that are walking around don't know answers to very simple civics questions. It'd be nice if most of our Arizona students weren't caught in that loop with erroneous answers. With that said, there's a few takeaways I see here. One is that we want a comparison version, the best you can pull together. The second is a list of stakeholders that have been involved so far. Don't know how that'll be pulled together, but something to that effect. Did you want to give this, Alicia, so I don't make a mistake? Okay, I didn't know if you were...
And the stakeholders were the community stakeholders.
Yeah, that's what the ones that weren't, we know the teacher groups, and some of those groups might be part of the parent groups, because a lot of teachers are parents. So I just want to see, and also the geographic distribution to make sure we're not just focusing on one or two areas.
Great. And then somebody asked, I think it was Member Taylor asked for results from other states that have already adopted the science and engineering practices, and then process of feedback from the working group and changes on how it was dealt with in the process. So I think that takes into consideration all the comments. Is there anything I'm missing? Okay, fantastic. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next agenda item.
President Arducci, members of the board, 4D is a presentation, discussion, and possible action to approve the dyslexia handbook pursuant to ARS 15-249.10. And I do believe we have a presentation or at least questions. If you have questions for the department, they're here. And Representative Norgaard is also present.
Thank you, Representative Norgaard, for being present. We recognize you, and thanks for the presentation that will be provided next. And before you even start, let me make a comment. I used to teach in a dyslexia foundation before I went to law school. And It's been a situation that I've been familiar with for 40 years now. I was taught a special method of teaching dyslexic children. I taught 4th through 6th grade. And so I read the handbook with special interest and think it's fantastic. Thank you.
That's great. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you, President Narducci, and hello, Superintendent Douglas and all the members of the board. Nice to be here. What I thought I would do is, well, first of all, this is Mary Wennerston, and she's on the International Dyslexia Association and Board of Directors, and Representative Norgard. I just wanted to talk about the activities that we've to support and maintain the handbook over the last year, and then talk about the updates over the last year. Besides meeting monthly with Representative Norgard, we also had a Dyslexia Action Task Force at the Arizona Department of Education, and it has been really exciting to be a part of this work. Over the last year, let's see, in November, Associate Superintendent Mike Manley and I presented the Dyslexia Handbook to 80 school psychologists at the Arizona Association of School Psychologists. And we received quite a bit of feedback, and that presentation informed a frequently asked questions page for the handbook, so that's new. I was able to attend the International Dyslexia Association conference, and Mary was present, along with another ADE person. And while I was there, I had a chance to meet with Nancy Mather, who's from our very own University of Arizona. Nancy wrote a book called Essentials of Dyslexia Assessment and Intervention. So we asked her to go through each section of the handbook and provide feedback to make sure that everything was in alignment. We also had, so if you look at the screen, on the left we have the Dyslexia Handbook, and on the right we have the Dyslexia Handbook Family version, which was a partnership of the International Dyslexia Association and the Arizona Department of Education and Read on Arizona. It's 3 pages, and it seeks to condense the information in a very friendly, very attractive way for parents, with lists of resources in the back. We had, in this last year, we also had quite a bit of parent feedback and teacher feedback and school district personnel feedback. What we heard was, what about dyslexia and English language learners? What about supports for school leadership personnel? What about supports for dyslexia and older students? Can you provide a glossary? Let's see. Can the specific learning disability information be more condensed into 1 or 2 pages? Because dyslexia, just because a person has dyslexia doesn't mean that they necessarily will have an IEP, depending on what the team decides. And we tried to, we put together 3 pages of parent activities. So activities that parents could be a part of, and we sought to align those the teacher section with those parent activities. Let's see. So in terms of what we plan to do in the future, we're putting together a brochure for Superintendent Douglas, so that when she goes on her next We Are Listening tour, she could help support that. Those parents and those educators with the newest updates and information. Do you want to add anything?
President Narducci, Superintendent Douglas, and board members. I also want to share with the Department of Education and the IDA, which is the International Dyslexia Association, the Arizona branch, and Read on Arizona, and some superintendent or special ed directors in some of the schools. We are going to be presenting at Teachers Institute and Leading Change. We are hoping to submit for the Special Ed Directors Institute, and we've also applied for the national conference this next year, and we haven't heard if we're going to be accepted. And the collaboration with Read On Arizona, we're helping create the parent handbook, but we're also looking for student, that there's almost like a cartoon or a flyer or brochure for students to understand when they are diagnosed for dyslexia. So we're doing a lot of collaboration with ADE and with our partners, also with Decoding Dyslexia, and working with any schools that are reaching out to understand about dyslexia.
Thanks, Mary. My name is Kim Rice. If we could just circle back to the very beginning. And I work in exceptional student services at the Arizona Department of Education. I was a special education teacher, infants through age 22 for about 15 years. So.
President Narducci, Superintendent Douglas, and members, my name is Jill Norgard. I'm a District 18 representative. And I've been honored to work with this group over the last 2 years. We were here 2 years ago and we identified this issue and this problem. And then a year ago, we came back and we decided about an implementation plan and putting a handbook together. And now we actually have a pilot program in place now in the Kyrene School District. And we are identifying kids and students right now with dyslexia, so we're really excited for the program. We have ongoing meetings every 6 weeks, and we bring in different stakeholders where we learn about what other states are doing, best practices. So I really appreciate it. I'm really excited that this is on the agenda because this is really a wonderful thing for Arizona students.
Thank you very much.
May
Any
I
questions?
Make one more,
oh, yes, you bet.
Again, I want to connect to the work with the handbook, but also for you to be aware that with the Move On in Reading legislation and the Department of Education created Teaching Reading Effectively, which is a 5-day training that schools could send students to, that the dyslexia information is also attached to that training so that they help them understand early literacy and the development of learning how to read. And so that is also part of that professional development. I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. And again, I just state it's fantastic. Any other comments from the members? Can we have a motion to, oh, we do.
I mean, I second that. I really like this resource guide for families. I first read this and I thought it's interesting, but it's dense. I mean, there's so much great information. So thank you for condensing it and making it user-friendly for families. And I guess I would also, if there was a way, I think it's on page 31, your sheet on older children. I mean, if you could sort of pull that out, because I think often we think of screening and identifying at younger ages, but there are, things you can do once a student, maybe hits in high school and they're just really struggling on reading, and it's not too late. And I appreciate that you said this in here, but if somehow we could make that a standalone document, and we can talk about that offline, but I think that would be of great benefit.
Thank you, Member Burton. We are presenting also at the Transition Conference for older students who struggle with reading and spelling. What can we do for them? But a handout or a brochure is a really great idea. So thank you.
Thank you. Can we have a motion to approve the update to the Dyslexia Handbook titled Dyslexia Handbook, a Technical Assistance Document to Support Families and Teachers?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Any comments? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President and members. Now, if we would have known you were involved in dyslexia students in 4th and 6th grade, we would have got you on the committee.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Thank you. We'll move on to the next agenda item.
President Narducci, agenda item 4E is the consideration to approve the criteria for valid literacy assessments for the use with the Move On When Reading collection of assessments exemption per ARS 15-701. And I believe we have Mr. Ross from the Department of Education who will be presenting on this topic.
Hi. Oh, that was louder than I thought it would be. President Narducci, Superintendent Douglas, members of the board, thank you so much for giving me this time to present, and I hope this is informative and concise. I'm Sean Ross. I'm the Director of K-12 English Language Arts and Move On When Reading at the Department of Ed. Prior to coming to the department, I was at the site level for 15 years, taught everything from 6th through 12th grade, so I have a wide range of experiences with education and literacy in particular. So up first, whenever I get a chance to present on Move On When Reading, I always open with our mantra, the purpose of the legislation. And the Move On When Reading legislation is designed to promote early identification and targeted intervention for struggling readers, so they're reading at grade level by or before the end of 3rd grade. So the retention piece gets a lot of the headlines, but the reality of this legislation is there are about 170,000 K-3 students in the state. There are 842 who were retained last year. So if you think of the number of students who are reached by this legislation, the number of students who benefit from this legislation, and 842 is too many. Again, I'm a teacher, but it has wide-ranging effect and wide-ranging impact. And we really like to highlight the fact that all K-3 students receive that diagnosis and that targeted intervention when needed. So the legislation itself has three key statutes that are associated with it. And just to highlight the pieces of those statutes that we sort of focus on the most, every school is required to have evidence-based reading curricula that instruct students in the 5 pillars of early literacy. So phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And then every LEA, every school is required to have a built-in assessment system for literacy, including a universal screener, a diagnostic tool, a progress monitor, a benchmark assessment, and then summative assessments as well. So they get the full scope of the assessment cycle. It also requires all schools to submit a literacy plan each year that details for the department the system that they're implementing and the results that they're getting through that system. They're required to submit literacy data 3 times a year, which we now comes with a narrative as well, where they reflect upon that data, so we get a chance to see how their students are progressing. And then finally, if a student does not meet the Move On When Reading cut score on the reading portion of the AZ Merit exam, then they're not promoted to the 4th grade unless they qualify for one of 4 good cause exemptions. And I will review those very quickly as well. So these have been in place since the beginning of the legislation, these first 3. And the first one refers to students who are English language learners with less than 2 years of English language instruction. The next one refers to students who are in special education referral or in the process of a referral and have been diagnosed as having significant reading impairment, including dyslexia. And dyslexia was a recent addition to the legislation. I think it was 2015. Third, a student who has an identified disability and has an IEP, and the IEP team, including parents, agrees that promotion is appropriate. So since the beginning of the legislation, these have been the 3 good cause exemptions. And recently, the board convened an ad hoc K-3 literacy committee made up of a number of stakeholders from around the state, and including Associate Superintendent Carol Lippert. And that subcommittee made a number of recommendations to improve the Move On When Reading legislation, including the addition of a new exemption. So this is that new exemption, and it calls for a student to be promoted if she or he has demonstrated or subsequently demonstrates sufficient reading skills or adequate progress towards sufficient reading skills on the 3rd grade reading standards as evidenced through a collection of reading assessments approved by the state board. So this was passed into law last year. It actually has not taken effect yet because it cannot be used until the data from this spring's AZ Merit data is collected. From the spring, AZ Merit exam is collected. So when we talk to the field about this new exemption, we sort of colloquially refer to it as the 1 bad day exemption. Prior to the passing of this new exemption, Arizona was the only state in the country with K-3 reading legislation who had a single data point that determined retention, and that was obviously problematic. We had issues with that as well. We're very excited when the ad hoc committee made the recommendation to the legislature to add this new exemption. And it's really for LEAs, and it's a rare exemption, to be honest with you, but it's really for schools where they have had a kid who just hasn't been on their radar the entire year. She's reading sufficiently, she's making great progress, and then she just has a bad day because it's 3rd grade and it's their first high-stakes summative assessment, and it results in what's supposed to be retention. So we were really excited about the passing of this new exemption. And just to give you some context about the initial rollout of the exemption, so the board opened an RFI process for literacy assessment vendors the board and the department reviewed the vendor proposals and built a list of specific standards that were addressed by those products. And you can see an example of that list at the top. The board reviewed the list of standards, and then that list was approved at the June 26th, 2017 board meeting. As soon as that process was done, we keep our ears to the ground, and we started hearing some feedback from LEAs about some concerns about the new exemption. And one of some of the feedback we heard, you can see here. So one of the key pieces was that the assessments that are listed on the board approved list are just not available to every LEA in the state. And there's a feeling that that's not equitable, that not every student can then take advantage of that new exemption. And that some of the most frequently used literary assessments in Arizona don't actually appear on the list. In fact, the most frequently used assessment in Arizona, DIBELS, does not appear on the list. And then it would require a yearly RFI process from the board to look at new elements of new assessments, to look at new assessments every year, and that this would be a larger process than maybe was intended. So we reached out to the board, and I want to take this moment to say how wonderful Executive Director Williams and Deputy Executive Director Baden have been. They really have been. It's been amazing to work with them. And so we got together and we made the decision together to build a list of criteria for valid literacy assessments. So in lieu of using a specific list of specific vendors that would have to be updated and reviewed each year and may inadvertently exclude certain kids in certain parts of the state, we were going to build a list of criteria that LEAs could then use to evaluate their assessments against to make sure they were valid. So the ADE Move On When Reading team, which is me, convened a group of experts, and we built the criteria for valid literacy assessment. And just to give you a heads up, these were the people involved. And I want to highlight a couple in particular. Terry Clark, who's the state literacy director, the head of Read On Arizona, and then Dawn Foley, who's the director of teaching and learning at Mesa Public Schools. And I wanted to highlight them in particular because they are also members of the K-3 Ad Hoc Literacy Committee that the board convened. So we made a real attempt, especially, to reach out to the people who had actually generated this new exemption to begin with as we looked at any potential changes that they may need. And then if you look at the list, there's a couple other things I would highlight. One, we made sure to have representation from special education, and then we also had representation from early childhood. So that way we kind of ran the gamut there. And this is the list itself. So the group generated a list of 6 criterion, and this is the list that they would like LEAs to use to validate their literacy assessments in order to take advantage of that new exemption through Move On When Reading. And just to highlight a couple of the key points, it's required that the assessment or assessments, because it is a collection of assessments potentially in the law, be reliable and valid, that they be aligned to Arizona's English language arts standards, particularly for reading literature, reading informational text, and foundational reading skills. That piece is especially important because that's going to hit students at the phonics level and at the fluency level. The assessment must be a reliable and valid test of third grade reading comprehension, and it must use a mixture of informational literacy, literary passages, from a variety of genres. The assessment must be norm referenced, and then the vendor must be able to provide norming studies from the past 10 years to sort of support the validity of their assessment. That was included in particular because the majority of benchmark literacy assessments used in the state, particularly something like Galileo or NWEA, are norm-referenced assessments, so they wanted to be consistent with that. And then scores from the assessment can be converted into percentiles or standardized scores so that they can be used, the data can be used in a multitude of ways. And then finally, there's strict test administration rules to, again, support the validity of that assessment so that when it is delivered consistently whenever it's used. So that's the list. And then just a couple things about the logistics for this new exemption. Again, LEAs can now use this criteria to determine if their current literacy assessments meet the requirement for the new exemption and as a guide when purchasing new assessments. So we thought that was a really nice little unintended consequence. LEAs can apply the new exemption beginning with data from this year's AZ merit exam. So it couldn't be used before that. This is the first time, which is actually why we're here now. We wanted to address this issue before it hit the field. And then the Maurer team, me, will begin collecting data on use of the new exemption with the October 2018 literacy plan submission. So we are actually already working with our IT department to add a new field to the Malware Literacy Plan, where LEAs report how many students were exempted from retention based on the new exemption. So that's actually already happening, already in place. Again, because I haven't hit it hard enough yet, the Movement and Reading team in Arizona is actually made up of 1.5 full-time employees. I'm the 0.5 because I'm also the director of English Language Arts. I like to say it's my left side because it's my photogenic side. We usually have a full-time specialist. We are without one at the moment, though we are hiring. But just to throw it in, because we're on public record, we are the smallest team for this type of legislation anywhere in the country by far. Most teams for this type of legislation are in the 10 to 13 range. So I like to say we are small but mighty. And this would be a good time to take any questions. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you. Thank you, Sean. Let's start from the right this time. I want to give.
I have a question.
Yes.
I was wondering how you would address the concern that came in from Excel and Ed based on Criterion 1 in particular, being based on a specific proven standard rather than relying on publishers' information. I have a healthy skepticism. I like to think of what publishers provide.
Sure. So that was actually taken into account by the group because we went to other states to look at how other states with similar legislation are handling a similar type of exemption. And Florida in particular has the 0.8 standard for validity and for internal validity for the assessment. And the group decided to not go with that strict sort of internal validity ruling because they were leaning into, and for good or for ill, I'm not making a value judgment on this because I do think it's a valid concern. They were leaning into the idea of empowering schools to use their products, to evaluate their products to see if they were sort of meeting their need, and that the products they felt they could get the information from the vendors to establish the validity. So they actually went with a more broad version of that. One of the other sort of concerns is that, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead.
Oh, yeah, just a follow-up question.
Sure.
So offhand, can you tell us what the range of internal validity for the assessments that districts are looking at using? Is it far below 0.8 or?
They didn't establish a range. So this is the criteria as it appears. So a couple of the other concerns that were brought up by the person who spoke for Excel and Ed, in particular about internal validity, related. They had sent a letter, I know, and it said in particular that they wanted validity should be evidenced in the alignment of the test with nationally recognized content standards, as well as specific evidence of content concurrent and criterion validity. We did not lean into that particularly as well because the evaluated against national contents felt sort of Common Core. Mm-hmm. And so we addressed that, the group addressed that in particular in number 2, talking about how these needed to be addressed to Arizona's English Language Arts standards.
Thank you. Jared?
Mr. President, thank you. It was an honor to be on the subcommittee bringing this forward. It's fun to see it almost take off with the new data coming in. So what does this do with the current list? Have you run the list that was approved with all its flaws through these tests? Is it going to get shorter or what?
Well, so actually what it's intended to do is eliminate that list altogether. Mm-hmm. So the hope is to actually not have a list of vendors, because that would require an RFI process each year where those vendors are reevaluated and new vendors.
I get that.
And instead to supplement that, to replace that, with the criteria, the list of criteria, so that the LEAs can judge whether or not their specific product meets the list approved by the board, or in purchasing meets the list. So there actually would not be a list of approved vendors after this year. Yeah, maybe verify that with Catcher.
Did we run any marbles and say, hey, number 1 would pass this test, number 2? I'm wondering is the iris getting larger or smaller here in terms of the available tests that our LEAs have access to?
Well, so the intention, President Narducci, Member Taylor, the intention is that it widens the list of assessments available to LEAs by not providing a specific list. That specific list, by its very nature, is going to exclude, the assessments that aren't on it. So the intent of the criteria list is to expand.
Okay. Well, I think we'll just need to be real clear with the field on what's going on, because if they're moving forward thinking, hey, this might be, a 4th exemption, and
Right.
We shift on them, a month before we do AZ Merit. I just think we need to have a really, solid communication plan on that.
And we share your concern. It's actually one of the reasons we wanted to address this now. We actually felt even though we're addressing it rather quickly before AZ Merit, we could message to the field, and it would be better to do it now than to have it happen after AZ Merit were taken and the data were in. We thought it was, it's better to be proactive even if it's a smaller window. So it's one of the reasons, again, to compliment board staff, one of the reasons that the time frame was rather short, and we were able to turn it around. We wanted to especially make this meeting because we knew AZ Merit testing was happening.
So they're not going to have to call you or call Alicia and say, here's how we passed it. They'll just need to keep some documents on file and move forward.
And they'll provide that data to us in their literacy plan each year. Yeah.
Love it. Okay.
Sorry, Alicia. I need to.
Thank you.
Thank
Other
you.
questions?
I have one question.
Oh, yes.
Member Burton.
How did you come up with 10 years for under the norming studies? I mean, so are you worried about eliminating or keeping out newer companies who are doing this work?
Well, no, actually, in our research of the most commonly used vendors in the state, most of them provide norming studies between the last 5 to 10 years. And then we also, 10 years, so that was kind of the industry standard. And then we also thought 10 years was a fair but safe range because standards are changed and standards are reviewed and revised on a cyclical nature, particularly in Arizona. We wanted to make sure that we sort of boxed them in to make sure that they could justify the validity of their norming references and their product in a reasonable time frame.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Thank you.
I have additional questions. One is, so there's the criteria here, and is there a list of indicators or more detail provided to districts as far as what they would need to provide to show that they're meeting those criteria?
No, not yet. We had to get over sort of this first domino, and then as soon as we know more information about whether or not this list is approved, or if we need to go back and maybe make some changes, my team and I will jump on making the necessary changes.
Okay, so I understand and appreciate the conversations that went behind Criteria 1 and the rationale for how we got to this point. I personally would just feel a little more comfortable if we added the the language of, like, I don't know, preferred higher, like, internal ability of 0.8 or something like that to ensure that that's being considered or looked at because, for obvious reasons. but leaving it as it is, but then providing that signal to the field that this isn't something important.
Yeah, and definitely, upon approval of whatever version of this document, there'll be guidance to come. Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Remember,
President Narducci, Superintendent Douglas, I have several questions, and I'm going to try and identify them all and see if we can get through it. And I apologize in the beginning because I don't have an expertise in the process by which assessments are validated. So these are all the steps that look to me to be what your staff does, and probably a lot of LEAs have people with these kinds of skills that they can do this work. But I just want to preface that, as you said in the beginning of your presentation, we're talking about 1,000 students here.
For this exemption?
Yes, at most. At most.
Yeah, I don't know.
So I think it's about 1,700 kids hit the 2% mark, and half of those kids, you said 842 retained. So we're only talking about another 842 students that are within that group that may be able to be promoted based on their demonstration through this fourth option. So it's a very, very small number of students in the context of over 100,000 third graders. So one of my concerns is that we're building this huge solution for a relatively small group of students. It's a very important part, but it's a small group. And my question would be, what is the burden that we are placing on the smaller districts or that may not have the expertise to go through a process like you're recommending here to validate that whatever benchmark assessment they're using meets these criteria. So that's one question is, in Arizona we allow all of our schools the freedom to choose whatever curriculum and benchmarks assessments they want, but this is also asking them to take another step, getting to be in the professional assessment testing profession, which is not something I don't know how prevalent that skill set is. So that's one of my first questions. So the second part is, given that we're making a fairly large solution, a very individualized solution to the problem, so we could have 500 plus different versions of assessments that we're allowing to meet this criterion. Was there any thought or discussion around the idea of just creating an AZ Merit reading retest? One test that the state says, if a kid has a bad day, that we'll have a second reversion. And this is not something we can do today under our contract, but I'm just saying long-term going forward, maybe we have a separate reading-only retest person available online or however that these 850 students could take. It seems to me that is a smaller, simpler, easier way to cope with it rather than allowing for having to go through all the work of validating these various benchmarks. It also seems to me that it allows from the board point of view, to have more control over what is the reading cut score that we're getting at going forward, rather than having to equate potentially 15, 20, 30 different assessments and trying to figure out how to compare what's the reading cut score on those ideas. So that's a bunch.
So I'll start with the second question, only because it's probably the easiest for me to answer. It's out of my purview. Any decision, obviously, about a new assessment of that type would be made, by you guys, would be made by the board and by our assessment branch. So I can't really speak to the addition of a new version of AZ Merit to be used as a retest. It's not something we considered because it's just so wildly out of the scope of work of what our committee could do, the decisions that we could make. So I know, unfortunately, I don't have any more information on that. Okay. But President Narducci, Member Wellborn, for the first question, so it was a concern of the committee, because I think it's a very valid concern. We don't want to add another layer of responsibility to LEAs. The trade-off the committee felt was the fairness issue. Was it better to ask them to use guidance that we provide to make a determination about an assessment that they either already own or already considering, or is it better to leave it as it currently is, where there are entire regions of the state that don't have this exemption available to their students? And so it was a hard decision either way. The committee decided to err on the side of sort of entrusting and empowering the LEA, and again, that is an added layer that I can't say for sure every LEA is equipped to handle, but it seemed to be more in the spirit of sort of where the state is moving with ESSA and with comprehensive needs assessments, and with LEAs really being empowered to look into their own systems and make their own wider level decisions. So because it sort of fell into the spirit of that, and the alternative was to exclude, potentially, just entire swaths of the state, they really felt like this was the better of the options. But that was a concern. It was something that they definitely, was definitely part of their thought process. Other questions?
Is there some input, perhaps, from fellow board members on the second question, which is the idea of having a simple single retest component available for this category of students in the long run? I understand we're pretty far down the path, and I know there's a new contract would be required, and we're going into menu of assessments. I'm just opening it up for input.
I would say from a school level perspective, having a retest in May would would be not realistic and not desirable. they would have just tested in April, and then behind testing comes a huge bunch of things, scheduling, proctors, test security, test preparation, all this kind of thing comes along with that whole thing. And so practically to mesh that with end-of-year things. And so I just kind of want to backtrack a little bit. And so what I'm seeing is basically you've got the one-day bad exemption, and then your idea is really to broaden to ensure, because districts are already doing a whole list of reading assessments, like we do DIBELS and DRA and blah, 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 and several times a year. And so basically we could take that portfolio and have it count in place of this, and you're basically broadening it to allow districts to use what they currently use.
Exactly, and which is actually already called, sorry, President Narducci, Board Member Mack, which is already also the assessments that are already called for in the Move On When Reading legislation. So it paired really nicely. Exactly. Exactly.
Let me just respond, please, just Member Mack's comment. Again, we have to remember we're talking about 2% of the third graders here. We're not talking about retesting the entire third grade. We're only talking about when we find out, when we get feedback from the department on the kids that don't pass, make the first cut scores. That would be May. So you're talking about some kind of testing at that point. Just again, for 2% of your kids.
President Narducci, if I may, also the statute does reference a collection of assessments, which does not seem to necessarily encapsulate a retest of AZ merit. And I don't want to speak for the ad hoc committee, but I know at the legislature, I think the intent behind that exemption was not a retest of the current statewide assessment, but to use assessments that are in use at the LEA. And so that's some additional context from the statutory standpoint. And also to your other point about creating a large solution for what is potentially a small population, I think board staff and department staff felt that the current solution, which is the RFI process, is potentially a larger and more cumbersome solution to what we're facing right now with the exemption, and that although this may be more of a burden for some of the smaller LEAs, this is a more streamlined process. And I think the board and the department can work on some guidance to help some of those smaller schools in terms of finding assessments that meet these criteria that have been previously used. And so we can help try to fill those gaps in terms of their capacity concerns. But I think that we both feel at the board and the department that this is actually helping streamline it a little bit more compared to the RFI process, which we would have to revisit yearly and have to reevaluate yearly, and we would continue to have concerns about, are we leaving assessments that we know meet these criteria but did not respond to an RFI and so are not on a list. And hopefully this will be easier for the field and also just from a broader policy standpoint. So that's just some extra information we wanted to provide.
Thank you. We'll go with one or two more comments on this, and then if something needs to be studied, we can study it in the future, and then we'll move for a motion. Cal?
Based on what the law is, this is probably the best way to go, but I do want to state that I certainly agree with Member Wellborn's, I believe, concern that we are creating so many options on accountability that at the end of the day, we're not going to have a whole lot of accountability. And I'm not speaking just about this, but I'm thinking about accountability across the whole system. And this is just another indicator of, if nothing else, a perception that there's so many ways to get to where you have to go that it really isn't all that difficult.
Thank you.
There's no standard.
Yeah, thank you. So with that all said, does the motion stand on what we haven't? Will the motion that would be given the same as in our recommendation, or does it altered anyway by the discussion? Okay, so can I hear a motion for the board to approve criteria for valid literacy assessments for use with the Move On When Reading collection of assessments exemption?
Moved.
Can I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed?
Nay.
Thank you. I think the ayes have it. Thanks for the discussion.
Thank you for your time.
Move on to the next agenda item, 4F, which is a presentation, discussion, and possible action to close rulemaking procedures regarding 72609.01 regarding middle grade teaching certificates. Does anybody have any questions for Deputy Director Baden? If not, can I have a motion to approve those?
I move that the board close rulemaking procedures for R7-2-609.01 regarding middle grades teaching certificate.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. We still have a quorum?
Yeah.
Okay. Go to next agenda item, 4G.
President Narducci, members of the board, 4G is an update on the proposed amendments to R7-2-606 regarding proficiency assessments for educator certification. The update is provided to you in the executive summary sheet as well as the outline that is attached. If members have any questions, and Deputy Director Baden is available, but if not, we can move on to the next agenda item.
Are there any questions? Seeing none, we'll move on. Item 5 on the agenda is to, do I have to?
President Narducci, members of the board, you just have to call to order.
Okay, thank you. I call to order the Arizona State Board for Vocational and Technical Education. We have 2 items on the consent agenda, and those are approval of the 2018 calendar for the Arizona State Board for Vocational and Technical Education, and approval of the extension of the Arizona Carl D. Perkins State Plan and funding for fiscal year 2019. Do we have any discussion on either of those? If not, can I call a motion to approve both?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
So we have second by Member Kay.
Okay.
All in approval? I'm sorry.
Aye.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. We will now move to the consent agenda for certification enforcement actions. We have 3 on the consent agenda.
President Narducci, if you could just say that you are now reconvening as the State Board of Education for items 6 and 7 and 8.
Yes, what she said.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. We are reconvening the State Board of Education for the purposes to fulfill the rest of the agenda. Makes it short and simple. We have item 7A is a presentation, discussion, and possible action to approve the negotiated. Item 6. We have the consent agenda, and we have all items on the consent agenda will be considered by a single motion with no discussion unless an item is removed and discussed. We have approval of the permanent revocation of any and all educator certificates pursuant to ARS 15-550 held by Carl Wagner and Joseph Massey. We also have approval of the voluntary surrender of the educator certificates held by Doris Calloway, Mandy Ezell, and Julie Rudnick. Do we have any that need to be brought off consent agenda? Can I have a motion to approve the consent agenda?
I move approval of the consent agenda as presented.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. We'll move on to agenda item number 7, which is certification enforcement actions. And I'll turn it over to Director Williams.
Members of the board, historically, the board chooses to do all the negotiated settlement agreements A1, 2, and 3 as one single motion. President Narducci, do you wish for the board to take items 7A, 1, 2, and 3 as presented as a single motion?
That would be my preference unless I hear some objection. Can I have a motion in a single motion for all of those?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Nay. And can I explain my vote?
You may.
Yes, thank you. this is an area that's been discussed by this board before, and I tend to agree with the member who is no longer on this board. I think this issue should be addressed in statute, and it's not. But this is really a contractual issue. And I get some of the notes I scribbled to myself on this is and I should speak to the first one, Peoria. I know we, at one point in time, had a buyout in our contract. So I'm wondering if this person did do it, didn't do it, obviously didn't do it. I don't even know if they still have that provision any longer. But the other question that goes through my mind, and I looked at it with all of these districts, I wonder, are these the only people in these districts that have broken their contracts? And why are certain people picked out to be brought before the board for unprofessional conduct in that? So I have kind of won't quite call it a crisis of conscience with it, but I think it's a contractual matter that should be dealt with at the district level.
Thank you. Next agenda item.
President Arducci, agenda item 7B. 7B is presentation, discussion, possible action on the findings of fact, conclusions of law, and recommendation of the Professional Practice Advisory Committee to approve the application for certifications of Brooke Huntington Smith, case number C-2017-644R. If the board members would like for myself or Mr. White to give a presentation on this case, we can do so. If not, it is up to the president if he'd like to call for a motion.
Let me ask the board. Does anybody need a description? Everybody read the materials? Is everybody ready for a motion?
Yes.
All right. Can I have a motion?
Mr. President, I move that the State Board of Education adopt the findings of facts, conclusions of law, and recommendations of the PPAC and grant the application for certification of Brooke Huntington Smith.
Thank you. Do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you very much. We'll move on to the next agenda item.
President Arducci, the next agenda item is summary of current events. There was one individual who was in the audience today that did miss the call to the public, so I did tell her I would pass out her information that she had on the standards that is coming around now. Do any of the board members have any other items they would like to place on a future agenda?
Member Baker.
Just want to make a real quick comment that I've made before in regards to assessments, and it's no one's fault, but we're spending all of our time looking backwards and doing autopsies, and I just really wish on the menu assessment, I'm fully aware of all the restrictions and the legal issues, but that we need to move on this as quickly as we can so that we aren't sitting here a year from now doing an autopsy again on what happened the current school year, and instead give some direction and some advance notice to our practitioners so that they can plan their instruction accordingly. That is our purpose. It's not our purpose simply to look backwards and say, well, that was a good year, that wasn't a good year. Yeah.
Thank you. Anything else?
Mr. President and Superintendent Douglas, in light of what Member Baker has discussed, I seem to recall that we did have some questions put out with regard to menu assessments that we had asked the staff to investigate, especially in particular the interpretation of the statute with regard to whether or not what grade levels had to be tested. That was one of the questions, and I don't know I can't recall off the top of my head if there were other questions, but is there further interpretation of the statute that we should be made aware of so that we can carry that forward?
President Arducci, members of the board, Member Wellborn, Deputy Director Baden and myself will have a conversation with you offline.
Am I the only person that's interested in the information, or
Mr. President, members of the board, I think I'm concerned that we're running a little bit outside of the parameters of this agenda item, which is really merely for a summary of current events without discussion by the board, but that is the intent of that item, or to set matters for a future agenda.
Understood. Got it. Okay. Anything further? Seeing none, our meeting's adjourned. No? Oh, we have to have a motion? Last time you told me you didn't need a motion.
President,
trouble finding a motion,
though. Before the motion, right, I just want to clarify or add, try to restate the issue. I would like to see items on the agenda that demonstrate that we are very aggressively pursuing resolving the issue of the menu of assessments. Okay, and I believe that's the sentiment that's being expressed. There's some questions that have been asked. We'd like to see those items on the agenda so we can start untangling this thing.
Okay. Okay. Sounds good. Can I have a motion to adjourn?
President Narducci, I was informed you do not need a motion.
Okay, I didn't think so. But can I have a motion to adjourn anyways? All right, everybody in favor? We're adjourned.
Adjourned at 12:39, which is 3 minutes later than Dr. Cora last month.
Oh, man, and that's where I was going.